HTML5 is the biggest thing to happen to the web since CSS. You've probably been hearing more and more about HTML5, whether on web designers' blogs, or interesting animation experiments, or maybe even clients are asking you to support HTML5. Today's browsers are implementing more and more of HTML5, from incremental evolutionary improvements such as stricter separation of presentation and semantics, to improved web forms support, to refined semantics, to revolutionary support for audio, video, and vector graphics capabilities that today's devices, in fact, today's mobile devices are depending on, whether you're using an iPhone or you're writing sites for the Android or even the Palm Pre. All of these devices now support HTML5 to some degree and even depend on it. In this video, you're going to learn how to create your first HTML5 document, how to take your existing HTML4 and XHTML code, and what changes and fixes you need to make to it, what bits you need to drop, what bits you need to change or update. Then, I'm going to teach you how to validate your HTML5 document so that you know that you actually made all the right fixes that you need to make, as well as adding new semantics, new web forms features, and of course, audio, video, and vector graphics. Finally, I'm going to talk about some of the more rare used aspects of HTML5, but also bleeding edge and experimental and exciting that you may want to consider using if you're developing for a specific platform, or maybe you're just building little experiments yourself to explore the boundaries of what HTML5 can do. My goal in this video is to teach you how to immediately start making some of these changes to your code and integrating them into your day-to-day workflow. Whether you're a web designer, developer, or author, I'm going to teach you that learning HTML5 is something easy that you can pick up and start doing today. So let's talk about where HTML5 came from. HTML was first invented by Tim Berners-Lee in 1990, and it's essentially undergone about 20 years of evolution. That's a long time for a technology to still be around, still be relevant, and be growing. So it's certainly the exception when you look at numerous technologies that are out there. HTML rapidly iterated after Tim's introduction through various different stages. HTML 2.0 was a draft that actually went to the IETF, Internet Engineering Task Force. The W3C continued to add and iterate upon HTML with HTML version 3. This was during the height of the browser war, when Microsoft Internet Explorer and Netscape Navigator were each innovating in their own different ways. And W3C was trying to corral everybody in one room and say, hey, let's all cooperate and build one HTML for the web. And HTML 3.2 was the result of a lot of that kind of discussion. It was really where we started to see convergence of HTML across different browsers, implementations, and the specifications. This was a really great time for web developers because you could start writing HTML that worked in every browser. The evolution of HTML continued. With HTML4, there were new capabilities of forms and tables introduced, not for layout, but rich semantic tables, data tables, multidimensional tables that you could use to express all kinds of data. And the forms in HTML4 were greatly improved over previous forms. In addition, perhaps the biggest change in HTML in its history to date, at least until then, CSS was deeply integrated into HTML in HTML4. And that really started off a lot of revolutions. HTML4 continued to be revised and updated until HTML 4.01. And this is really where it stayed for quite some time. Meanwhile, literally as HTML4 and 401 were being wrapped up, W3C was developing XML, stands for Extensible Markup Language. The idea was that XML would solve two problems that HTML had always had. The first was that web developers and web authors were really sloppy and messy with their HTML, created all this bad markup, posted it on the web, and it made it really hard to build web browsers and other web user agents, is what they're called. XML was designed from the beginning to be clean, 100% valid, and require validity, so that even if a single error was in your page, the page would have to stop processing at that point, at the point of the error. So it was going to usher in a whole new era of clean markup. In addition, the second advantage that XML was going to bring us was that HTML had a limited set of tags. So for those of you that like to author richly semantic markup, you know that all you had to work with was a very limited set of what was in HTML. XML allowed anyone to make up their own tags. And so we could potentially make up tags for everything on the planet. And while this seemed like a boon at the time, it turns out not everyone is an informatician or a taxonomist who really understands how to create a new language. I mean, when was the last time you created a new language? Or anyone you know? I would say almost never. Even other attempts at creating new languages like, say, Esperanto by experts in the field haven't really succeeded very well. So XML was developed, and then a version of HTML forked off from the HTML4 development called XHTML1 that was HTML4 but reformulated in XML. So if you think about this, like being able to use all the tags you're used to using in HTML, but with XML, strictness, validity, conventions, all of that. And for a while, this actually proved to be a really good educational tool because it helped bring a lot of web developers away from the presentational-centric HTML 3.2 world and say, okay, now it's time to update to XHTML. And by that, we mean XHTML strict, that's compatible with web browsers, and uses CSS for styling. This was a really good time in the evolution of the web because web developers started to develop for multiple devices, multiple media, publish more semantic markup, make it more accessible, and it really was when the web flourished. Meanwhile, back at W3C, they kept evolving XHTML and decided that, well, what really needed to happen was the modularization of XHTML into separate modules that other languages could adopt and reuse if they wanted. And that's what XHTML 1.1 is. It's just the same as 1, pretty much just rebuilt out of these modules, and now it requires XML rather than in XHTML 1. It's still permitted serving it as text/HTML, which meant the browsers could understand it. And so this was really where XHTML started to kind of diverge from the web, and we'll see where that ended up. At the same time, the W3C still kept iterating on XHTML 1.0, the compatible version of XHTML, and produced the second edition of that, which was very good. And finally, all the work that was being developed, put at W3C into HTML or XHTML, was put towards XHTML2. And we'll get back to where that went. But that's essentially where W3C's efforts ended up along that path. Meanwhile, back when XHTML was essentially just being tweaked, I mean, this was a number of years as this was happening, a bunch of the folks over at Opera decided to explore, well, what happens if we took some of the forms in HTML4 and extended them a little bit further? And that's where Web Forms 2 specification came out and arrived. And that started to iterate as a specification, first proposed to the W3C, then outside the W3C. Eventually, it got integrated into a specification called Web Apps. Web Apps 1.0 incorporated web forms and was an iteration of HTML4. This, in turn, became what we're now calling HTML5. The lesson to be learned here is that XHTML2, with the path it took with XHTML 1.1 and continuing to sort of follow in the direction of XML and the idea of new vocabularies and being deliberately backward incompatible with XHTML 1.0 or HTML4, diverged from the web. The web did not stop evolving just because W3C decided to clean it up. The web continued to evolve, and it turned out that all these, the folks at Opera, the folks at Apple with Safari, and the folks at Mozilla kept developing their browsers. They weren't going to stop development just because the W3C was pursuing a specific path. So this really came to a head in the year 2004 at what I'm calling the Great Web Semantic Schism. W3C held an event, was called Workshop on Web Applications and Compound Documents. And this workshop was in San Jose, brought together browser representatives, W3C staff, HTML working group folks, CSS working group folks, SVG working group folks, mobile product representatives, other folks like Adobe, essentially a pretty broad plurality of web technology folks. And the wonderful thing is, since W3C does this work out in the open, you can actually go look at the workshop notes for yourself and go see who was there, etc. But what really happened during this workshop was it just happened to bring together the right people, or maybe the people that happened to be the most interested in what was going on at the time, or frustrated perhaps, with the evolution of HTML on the web. And the end result was what I'm calling the Great Web Semantic Schism. And if you look at the minutes of the workshop, you can find that during the closing minutes of the workshop itself, there were these questions asked, these polls taken that a lot of folks didn't participate in because they were just plain frustrated. However, you look at the very final polls that were taken is really about HTML and XHTML and how are we going to evolve, or if either one, for the benefit of the web. How should web authors write documents in the future? On the one hand, you had a group of folks who wanted to continue to evolve HTML4, iterate upon it, because that's what made sense for browsers, for web authors, web designers. On the other hand, you had another group of folks that wanted to evolve XHTML, continue the path along, incorporating more and more XML technologies, XHTML2, XForms, SVG, MathML, because that would lead us to a cleaner, more structured, et cetera, web that everyone should be doing and using. And what really made this interesting was on the side that wanted to iterate on HTML4, you had every single browser representative there in unison agreeing that that was the right path to take. And on the other side, pursuing the evolution of XHTML2 and the integration of all these XML technologies, you had mostly W3C staff, representatives of a few mobile companies, and a few other participants that were there for various reasons. This was remarkable because never in the history of W3C had I ever seen all the browser representatives actually agreeing on something, and yet the W3C disagreeing with them. Because W3C was in many ways formed to bring these debating, or some people say fighting browser representatives together to a common place to actually find common ground. Well, if the browser vendors had found common ground with the evolution of HTML, but the W3C was going off in a different path, you can only conclude what was going to happen from that. And it's what we call in open source circles a fork. And that's exactly what did happen. A survey was taken, and the results of this survey in the closing minutes of the workshop, all you can see from the minutes is there were 8 for, 11 against, or 8 for, 14 against. But what was really happening was the folks that wanted to iterate on HTML and DOM, it says only 8, but that represents folks from Apple, Opera, Mozilla, Microsoft, and Red Hat. And that's an amazing number of implementers all having to agree on a single path. So despite the fact that they seemed outnumbered, it was clear to everyone in the room that something had changed, that this many implementers had gotten together and found common ground, and that that common ground was outside of the direction W3C was taking. So out of this, 2 groups were formed. Microformats.org was formed within about a year to pursue the evolution of HTML by taking the class ID and rel attributes in HTML and adding more semantics using these natural extension points, using valid HTML4 and valid XHTML1 compatibly with existing web designer and developer practices. Another group was formed, the WHAT working group, the Web Hypertext Application Technologies working group, that pursued a far more challenging mission, which was to take HTML4 itself and evolve it and iterate it, adding new features, adding new web forms support. This was started by the browser vendors that happened to be present, most of the browser vendors at least, that happened to be present at that Compound Documents and Web Applications workshop in 2004. So basically for 5 years, we had heated divergence between the directions that the web community was taking, web development and design community was taking with microformats, with the direction that the browser makers were taking with the WHAT working group, and with the W3C. Finally, on 2008 and finally in 2009, the work started to converge, that W3C brought in the WHAT working group work and decided to call it HTML5. So this evolution was really good to see because people could see that, okay, well, at least there's hope for some sort of convergence. In 2009, the W3C finally agreed to stop development on XHTML2 and focus on HTML5. This was a great development for all those of us involved with the development of web standards and websites in general. Because for what this means is that finally we have browser makers, web authors, web developers, invited experts in various fields, and the W3C all working towards the common goal of evolving the web with HTML5. It very much resembles what happened in the late 90s and early 2000s with the cooperation around HTML4 and browser developers implementing that, and CSS as well. And we all remember what happened then was this incredible renaissance of websites and web development techniques that all of us came together and figured out, here's how we can best use HTML4 semantics. Here are some amazing things we can do with CSS. Around that time, CSS Zen Garden came out, etc. Now the same thing is happening with HTML5. So I'm going to teach you a bunch of these basics and new techniques and things to take a look at. What we really need is for all of you to also help participate in the evolution of HTML5, to showcase your brilliant works that you've come up with, that you've implemented with HTML5, to share your techniques, to help the web evolve to the next level. So before we get into the detailed bits of HTML5, I want to give you a little bit of an overview of HTML5 and what we'll be talking about today, just so that you have an idea of where we're going and what potential there is. Like you've heard, HTML5 is the future of the web. As far as XHTML and XML and other attempts to evolve the web, these have all really converged now, and everyone that was working on those is pretty much working towards making HTML5 work. So that's where I would say we need to focus all of our efforts and energies on. Second, it's the easiest HTML to get started with. So if you're a beginner, I really encourage you to try out the samples and examples that I'll be demonstrating in this video tutorial, and you'll be surprised at how easy it is to get started. Third, it's the most powerful HTML ever. So if you're an advanced user, a web author that's been authoring for 10 plus years, maybe even 15 plus years, or a web developer, take a look at some of the more advanced features of HTML and you'll be impressed. There's a lot here to build new applications with. So, what's the adoption strategy that I recommend? Start with the basics. I'll give you all the basics today that you need to get started, that you can use on your websites today across all browsers. Update your HTML4 knowledge. A lot of us that have been following the web know how to author in HTML4, know it really well, all the tags inside and out, and CSS as well. But the key here is that there are just enough changes from HTML4 to HTML5 in some of those tags that you've been using year in and year out. You really need to pay attention to these changes. And finally, as you find practical need for the new features in HTML5, add them in. I would say 1 or 2 at a time at most. And this is so that you can become familiar with them and develop experience with how they work, rather than just try to use them all in some sort of kitchen sink type approach. So incremental adoption is the right strategy here. What I want to cover real quickly before is the text conventions that I'm going over in this presentation. If you see blue in the presentation, that means those are hyperlinks to further documentation, resources, examples, and in the version of the presentation that you might find accompanying the video, you can actually click on those to actually access those resources. Code will be shown in a fixed space font, and if you see code that's bold and gray, that means it's older code and it's either been deprecated or obsoleted, or it's just code that I recommend you should avoid or transition away from. If you see orange code, that means that it's code that you can use, but you really should only use for transitional purposes. That is, you may need it for compatibility with older browsers, but it's not new, really. It's just a tighter version of what you should be using to ease your transition. Finally, when you see code that's bold in fuchsia, that's new code. That's either new HTML5 code or new techniques reusing markup that you already know how to use. Now, there's 2 basics of HTML5 that I'm going to cover for you, and it's going to really empower you to get started immediately. The first is the doc type. Now, if you've been using HTML4 for any amount of time, you know that at the top of all your documents, you have something that looks like this. Here we have an XHTML 1.0 strict doc type, and until HTML5, this really was, for all practical reasons, one of the best doc types you could use in all your web documents that you publish. Look at all that cryptic information. What does that all mean? Well, it comes from the SGML heritage of HTML, and frankly, I've never memorized it. I always copy and paste it or start from templates myself when I type this in. And I know that I can pick it apart if I have to, but I usually don't bother. In HTML5, there's a new doc type. They've simplified down this down to simply less than, exclamation, doc type, HTML greater than. That's it. It's so short and simple, you can just type it in. The second bit of HTML5 that I want to cover for you is the improvements to the meta charset. One of the big changes that's been happening over the past 10 years is from using various different character sets on the web, we've all been converging on one that's called UTF-8. And so for the most part, we've been publishing documents with this little directive at the top called meta HTTP equiv that has a content type, et cetera, et cetera. But the key piece here that we really meaning to express to the browser, to the server, is charset equals UTF-8. Well, the developers of HTML5 recognized this and also did a bunch of tests. So they've simplified this down to just meta charset equals UTF-8. And that's, again, something that's so short that you can remember it and even just like type it off the top of your head. Best part of this, it works in all existing browsers that are popular on the web today. So thanks to the way that they parsed the old meta equiv, this new meta charset actually works, and we can start using it. Why don't we go ahead and I'll show you exactly how easy this is. I'm going to go to my source view here, little text document, and this is so simple that just type it in, doctype HTML, meta charset equals, quote, UTF-8, end quote. Done, right? And I promise you, go ahead and just try typing it yourself. You won't even need to start a new document, new template document. You type it again, and after you basically type this a few times, and I know it sounds kind of silly, but after you typed it, let's say like 10 times, your muscle memory will be able to, will have picked it up to the point where you can just like type it in off the top of your head to any new document. And that to me is really powerful because you can basically just start brand new blank text document on any computer, right? And just start typing HTML5 because you've memorized that you can type exclamation point doctype HTML meta charset equals UTF-8. And that's it. Now that you know the basics and getting started with HTML5, with writing your first HTML5 document, I'm going to teach you about the key transitions that you need to be aware of when moving your HTML4 and XHTML1 documents over to HTML5. The first of these is that you really got to remove all that presentational markup. The second is there are a number of features in HTML4 that have unfortunately failed on the web as they were intended, and so HTML5 removes these features and you need to remove them from your content as well. Third, how to maintain compatibility. HTML5 is here in various forms and various browsers. However, there are still some older browsers that require some quirky, shall we say, coding techniques. Cover a couple of those that you might need to be aware of depending on what browsers you need to support. Next, there are bits and pieces of HTML that aren't necessarily failed, but they're kind of obsolete. We've developed better techniques over the years, and so HTML5 formalizes some of these better techniques, and I'm going to teach you how to make those transitions as well. HTML4 and XHTML deprecated almost all presentational markup, which was a wonderful thing because it ushered in the renaissance of CSS-based websites that have even more beautiful presentations, and semantic markup that's good for users, good for web applications, good for browsers, good for search engines, etc. All right, let's get into this. Plain text tag. I doubt many of you have seen this or use it, but if you do, you need to start using the pre-tag instead. Everything to do with fonts, you need to not have in your markup anymore, whether it's base font, the big tag, the font tag, or the TT tag. You need to drop those and switch instead to just using the CSS font properties. They work much better, they're much more powerful, and they're much more maintainable. You might be wondering, what about the small tag? Well, we'll get to that in a later section. Anything to do with text decorations, strikes, strike-throughs, underlines, all of these are replaced by the CSS text decoration property. Alignment and centering. The center tag has been deprecated for quite some time. CSS techniques for centering work great, people understand them, as well as alignment. So whether you're aligning center or if you're doing align left or align right, so either use text align or margin auto for blocks, or if you're floating things using align, like image align, you need to be using the CSS float property for those. There's still some attributes on the body element that or presentation as well. Link, A-Link, V-Link. If you've never used these, you're lucky. But if you're a long-time web developer, you might have used these to change the color of links on the page. You don't need to be doing that anymore. Universal across all modern browsers is good support of CSS pseudoclasses, :link, :visited, and the color property. It's really easy to replace those. Next, there are a number of features in HTML4 that have failed, unfortunately, and HTML5 removes them and makes them not part of the language anymore. So you need to drop them for various reasons. The first is the long desk attribute. There's kind of a sad story here because long desk was really intended to help enable accessibility. But this attribute, though, unfortunately, just did not do the trick because, first of all, it was invisible. Nobody really implemented it except for maybe a few obscure user agents or maybe some accessibility tools. The problem with that is that because it was hidden in this attribute, in the image tag that no one ever saw, it really rotted. Like people that used it for the wrong thing. For example, do you know what goes in long desk attribute? Is it text description? Is it a URL? It's not obvious, is it, from just the name of it? Well, it takes a URL. Well, a lot of people would just put in literally a long description of the image. That seems natural, but that's not what it's for. So this attribute's broken, it's failed. If you were using long desk attribute, what you should do instead is just include a visible description, visible long description with the image that helps all users and not just those that can't see the images as well. Or if we don't want to include a visible full description, include a hyperlink next to the image saying longer description of this image. If you need to hide that with CSS, you can go ahead and do so. In either case, there are a number of alternative techniques that you can be using today. Okay, this is a big one. Everything to do with frame sets and frames, you just got to drop. These have been known to break the web in numerous ways for a long time. I think we can blame the original browser wars for introducing these tags in the first place. Well, thankfully, HTML5 has dropped them and gotten rid of them. It's time to drop them from any and all sites you're using as well. This really means that if you were using them, you need to redesign your site to not use them any longer. I guarantee that once you do that, you're going to get accessibility and usability gains just by switching away from frames. If you still need to embed some content that's HTML inside your HTML, like in a nested way, that's in a separate file, you can use iframes to do that. Even then, I would caution against it. It's not the best technique, but it's a transitional technique that you can make use of. Here's another attribute you probably didn't even know existed, the version attribute on the HTML element. What does it do? Almost no one knows because browsers never actually did anything with it. So if you happen to use that in your code, just get rid of it. It wasn't doing anything anyway. More failed features. The scheme attribute of the meta tag is one that, aside from obscure informaticians and maybe some semantic web folks, no one ever really used. It just does not have practical use on the real World Wide Web. And that's because, frankly, as part of the meta tag in general, it's invisible metadata. And if there's one lesson that we've learned over the past 10 years, is that invisible metadata should be avoided because it's a waste of time, it gets corrupted, it rots over time. There's tons of documentation that describes why invisible metadata has failed. In fact, the top search engines like Yahoo and Google, they ignore meta keywords, for example. And yet you find tons of SEO snake oil salesmen just incorporating that into part of their pitches and what to do to your pages. You don't need it. So just drop meta scheme and drop anything similar to that. If you want to incorporate metadata in your document, keep it visible, keep it indexable, and keep it up to date. Once you have that visible content in your document, add microformats to it so that it's semantically marked up so that browsers can do things with it, search engines can recognize and index it. And that's really the direction that semantic markup is moving across the whole spectrum of folks developing for the web. This next attribute that's been dropped has really caused quite a bit of controversy, unfortunately, and that's the rev attribute. I'm sad to say that the rev attribute does actually have some uses. For example, the vote links microformat makes use of it. However, all the studies that have been done to date, the studies that Google has done, the informal studies that have been done with web designers and web authors, informal surveys, in fact, and even my own experience in teaching, the rev attribute is just too confusing. It's often misunderstood. People use it when they think they mean rel, they mix the two up. So HTML5 drops it. If you were using the rev attribute for anything, take a look at equivalent rel microformats instead. We believe we've solved most of these problems with microformats. If you have a use of rev attribute that you think is still necessary, join the microformats community, discuss your problem, and I'm sure we can come up with a workaround. There's a couple of things I need to talk about for maintaining compatibility with much older browser implementations. The first is, with the script tag, you no longer actually have to say what the language or the type or anything of the script is. Because what is the script that we all use today in our web pages? We use JavaScript, right? That battle was fought long ago and has been over for a long time. If you're using a script on a web page, it's JavaScript. It's not going to be some other kind of script. HTML5 formalizes this and says if you just have a script tag, it's JavaScript. But if you're still using or supporting browsers that are old, perhaps say 10 years old, you may need to indicate explicitly the type of the language. And if you do, you can do so with a type attribute. Type equals, quote, text/JavaScript. And that's all you should do. You shouldn't use this for anything else. If you include a type attribute, include it like this, and don't worry about it. The nice thing is that because it's basically just restating the obvious, that you're using JavaScript, you can just leave it in there. It's harmless, it's fine, it's not going to cause any trouble in the future. The second is, this is one of the very few presentational artifacts left in HTML5, and that's the border attribute of the image tag. And that's because in some older browsers that don't support CSS, we're talking really old now, what they do is they put these little blue links around images that are hyperlinked. And developers for a long time have been including the directive or the attribute border equals 0 to get rid of the blue borders around those links. And that's something that HTML5 has formalized and said it's okay. You can still have a border attribute on the image tag, but only if you set it to 0. Any other use of the border attribute has now become invalid. So this is simply a technique to maintain compatibility. And again, you can leave it in there if you'd like. It's not going to cause any damage long term. That's something else that might be deprecated eventually, but when it is, you'll find it when you validate your document. Again, there's going to be no long-term bad effects of that. So let's talk about XHTML. Now, to date, most web authors have been using HTML4 or equivalents. A lot of folks, myself included, made the transition to XHTML in the early 2000s, along with the transition from, frankly, transitional markup to strict markup. And so we really advocated using XHTML strict with semantic markup, and modern web designers and modern web design magazines and articles all advocated this direction. And it really resulted in a cleaner, more semantic web for a lot of folks. Well, you can continue to use XHTML with HTML5. And you may wonder, well, how do you do that? A lot of the techniques that were developed for keeping XHTML compatible with even HTML4 are still valid. So what this means is, first of all, you have to self-close empty HTML4 tags explicitly. For example, the following tags: meta, link, the break tag, horizontal rule, image, input, and option are all empty in markup parlance, which means that there is no closed tag. There is no separate closed tag. There's only attributes in the tag. So when you use any one of these, put that closing slash at the end of the tag to indicate that it is an empty tag. And this will allow your content to continue to be processed as XHTML. This is okay and allowable in HTML5, and I encourage it if you want to maintain XHTML compatibility. The second is always use quoted attribute values. And actually, this is a recommendation that I make to anyone that authors HTML. Even though it's one of those things that you need for XHTML, I think it's something you should do regardless, because it really helps avoid errors. Here's an example. If you say image source equals photo1.jpg, now you're really depending on the browser to be intelligent about realizing when does the value of the attribute start and when does it finish. If you put quotes around it, and there I've added the slash as well to indicate the image is an empty element, it maintains compatibility with XHTML and it avoids errors. If you happen to have, for example, the name of an attribute as part of the name of your image and there was a space inserted, your image might not be recognized. So this is just one of those coding techniques that's compatible and just encourages good code and fewer errors. The errors that impact you the least are the ones that you never write. So go ahead and always use quoted attribute values. Now you may be wondering, when I showed you the doctype and meta care set for HTML5, where the HTML tags were, or the head tag or body tag and all that. If this is all you need to start an HTML document, where are the rest of those? Well, the reality is that all you need, in addition to those tags, is a title, and then any other content. So for example, a paragraph. You actually don't need a body or a head tag or an HTML tag in HTML5. You didn't really need them in HTML4 either, but they were encouraged to keep the document clear, to have a consistent start and beginning, end, and all that. Well, for XHTML compatibility, one of the things that you should include for what they call a consistent document object model are all the tags explicitly. So in this case, we take that doc type HTML example and we add the HTML tag around the entire thing, right? So doc type HTML, and then we have our head tags, open and close, around the meta charset and the required title tag, and then we have the body tag as well. It's a little bit more typing or a little bit more of a template, but it's a small price to pay to keep your XHTML documents valid and still usable as XHTML. Another common example where people run into this is in tables. So myself and many others, we write really simple tables. All we have is a table with a few rows and a few cells, and all you really need for that are the table, TR, and TD elements. However, if you want to maintain document object model compatibility with how this is interpreted in XHTML versus HTML, then you need to explicitly include a tbody tag around all your rows. Just think of it as part of the table tag that you're creating. So when you do open table, do an open tbody, do all the rest of the table rows and table cells you would mark up, and then a closed tbody and a closed table. Later on, if you want to make use of some of the more advanced table features like t-head and t-foot, you can do so because it's already clear where they should go. But for now, just consider when you're creating these valid semantic tables, none of you should be using tables for layout now, right? Include tbody and close tbody inside the table. Next, there are bits and pieces of obsolete markup that have remained in HTML4 that HTML5 finally drops because we figured out how to get rid of them, we figured out how to transition away. The first of those is the acronym tag. Oh boy, I cannot count the number of hours and number of email messages wasted discussing whether I should use an acronym or an ABBR for a particular usage. And so if anything, at least it's going to finally put an end to all those arguments. Frankly, just use the ABBR tag instead. You don't need to use the acronym tag. It's gone. Don't use it anymore. If you had any, just change them to ABBR. Search and replace. Don't even think twice about it. Don't ask yourself why you made a decision in the first place. Don't go reopen those rat holes. Second, the applet tag. This was popular in the 90s when people were trying to publish Java applets as part of their web pages. Well, a lot of the web has sort of moved on from publishing Java applets, though there may be still a few out there. If you're still doing so, or if you have a specific need to publish a Java applet in your web pages, you need to follow the direction that HTML4 set and use the object element instead. There are details for doing this, documented on the web. Lots of folks have techniques, so depending on your application, you'll find a way to do this. But the short answer, drop your applet tags and switch to using the object tag, which is valid HTML5. Next, there's a dir tag that has been around since a very long time for directories and directory listings, and this has been dropped from HTML5 as well. Instead, just go ahead and use it on ordered list. If you need to style it differently, use CSS. This is a big change that has occurred, and it's about time. HTML in the early days encouraged named anchors to give you little spots in the middle of a document or different sections of a document that you could link to with the hash ID references, shorthand name references. And it resulted in documents with these empty a name elements, a name and then a name value and close a, and littered them all over the place. Well, since HTML4, you've not had to do that anymore. You can simply use the ID attribute on any element now, and we'll talk more about that later, to specify that this is a named container that you want to reference. So if you have a hyperlink that ends in like hash A1, for example here, it will reference that new div instead of that old a name. This is more semantic and actually helps you refer to a specific section of a document, start and end, containment, rather than just a point in a document. If you still want to refer to a point in a document, great. You can put in a span that encapsulates exactly the specific point you're trying to reference, and you can do that too. Span ID equals etc. But most common uses of the ID and the name attribute were to reference whole sections of documents. And for this, you really should be using a div or whatever other semantic markup that encapsulates that section to refer to it and using an ID attribute on it. Similarly, the name attribute on images was being used sometimes in forms. You don't need to be doing this anymore. ID attribute works fine for images as well. And I've added in the closing slash for XHTML compatibility. So those are the bits and pieces of HTML5 that you need to now know in order to transition your HTML4 over to HTML5 and your XHTML as well. There's not that many of them, but they're just enough to be aware of that while you're transitioning them, you need to make sure you make those fixes. So in summary, use CSS instead of presentational markup. You've been hearing this for at least 10 years now, and time is up. HTML5 drops those features. You need to use CSS. Learn to live it and love it. Drop some of these attributes that really have had either no impact or they've been broken for quite some time. Rev, Longdesk, etc. If you've been using frames, you need to redesign your site to not use frames. In a few cases, like for the JavaScript languages, script tag, you may need to indicate the language explicitly through the type attribute. You don't need to do that in general. However, if you do use really older browsers, you can continue to do so. Update all your references to A-names, to using the ID attribute, change your acronyms to abbreviations, change your applets to objects, change your dirs to ULs. Again, not that many. Now that you've discovered what are the key pieces of transition that you need to make from your HTML4 and XHTML to HTML5, I want to talk about some notable changes to HTML4 features that are now different in HTML5. These fall into three categories. The first is semantic refinements and recastings. Some of the elements they're used to working with now have better defined semantics, more precise semantics, and some of the elements that you may not be using very much have been recast to be more semantic and to actually have meaning. There are various bits and pieces of black sheep in the world of markup that HTML5 is actually finally acknowledging. Some of these were in the specification in HTML4, and some were never in any HTML specification and are actually being introduced officially into HTML5 after being neglected for so many years. Finally, there's some parts of HTML5 that actually break what we've been doing with the web with semantic markup as well. And in particular, site element. I'm going to teach you about what HTML5 has done so far to date to the site element and what you can do to work around it. So let's talk about those semantic refinements. There's just a couple of them actually that you need to really pay attention to. The first is the M element. What you can now do officially is actually nest them to indicate stronger emphasis. So in cases where you may already be emphasizing something, like when you're quoting someone, you want to emphasize it really strongly, and then you want to emphasize something that they say even stronger than that. Here's what you would use a nested M element. Instead of, in the past, you would use a strong element. And that brings us to the next semantic refinement, which is the strong element has been refined or perhaps even redefined to mean importance rather than emphasis. This is a subtle but important distinction. You'll find that as you start using these elements in this new way, you'll slowly get used to their new meanings. Fortunately, these meanings are not connected to their styling, right? You can style emphasis and strong however you like in your CSS. So keep that in mind. In addition to the semantic refinements that HTML5 brings, there are several elements that HTML5 actually semantically recasts as being meaningful that used to be presentational. The first of those is a small element, which typically has been used as a counterpart to big, but has been recast to mean anything that's small print, which in this case means, from a meaning perspective, disclaimers, caveats, copyrights, all of those kinds of markup or content that you put in your page, you can now mark up with a small element to indicate that semantically it's something that has a little bit of a lighter voice, probably going to be presented differently, oftentimes smaller if it's a visual medium. But in other mediums now, you can take advantage of these semantics and style it accordingly as well. The second is the I element. And you're thinking, wait a minute, I means italics. How could you possibly redefine that to mean something semantic? Well, it turns out that If you look at typography, if you look at various manuals of style, italics are used in a number of different, very semantic situations that don't actually have their own markup. So in HTML5, the I element is redefined to mean an alternate voice or mood, or perhaps a technical term, like a taxonomy, or the name of a species, or an idiom. These are all often enough used that HTML5 redefined the I element to mean this semantic, which you can now use. Of course, don't let that make you think that I just means italic anymore. Go ahead and use CSS to style it however you want. B tag has been similarly redefined, recast, to mean stylistically offset text. You may be wondering, well, what are instances of that? Sometimes keywords or product names or lead paragraphs are often stylistically offset from the rest of their content. And this is now the example of cases that you can actually use the B tag semantically. And I'm going to give you an example now, a real-world example that I actually happened across myself, which is the title of this work itself. And if we take a look at that, HTML5 now, a step-by-step video tutorial for getting started today, if we want to code that up, in addition to, of course, typing in the usual document header, right, with our meta-char set and doc type, then we type up the text first. Always I recommend HTML5 now, a step-by-step video tutorial for getting started today. Then it's clear that even from our HTML4 semantic knowledge, the HTML5 now is an H1, right? And a step-by-step video tutorial is a nice H2 subhead. And here is where we're going to start bringing in some of these new semantic refinements and recastings. If we take a look, the first thing we notice that's most obvious is that the word HTML5 and the word today are both stylistically offset. Now, I didn't read those in a different voice, or I didn't emphasize them at all, but they are different in the presentation. In this case, we find a perfect example of when you would use the B tag. So we mark up the HTML5 with B, as well as today with B. Make sure you get your close tags to balance your start tags. The next thing you might notice is that the number 5 is larger here. And I even spoke it with a stronger, more important level of emphasis. Now you might say, well, it was emphasized, but what's going on there is I'm saying that the number 5 is important. And that is a good example of when you would use the new semantically refined strong element. So we go ahead and mark up the 5 as being strong, because that's important. That's what we're talking about. The piece that I did emphasize was the word now. And that's really what we're talking about. We're not just talking about HTML5, we're emphasizing that you should get started with HTML5 now. And so that's a clear case of where we want to use the M element. Now, if we take a look at this, we've made use of the new B tag, the semantically refined strong tag, and the semantically refined M tag, all in one example. Let's move on to the next elements that have been semantically recast. The BR tag, which simply meant a line break, now has been formalized to actually mean that it implies semantics of a line break, whether in spoken form or in visual form. For example, poems, addresses. Line breaks here actually have a meaning, and so if you want to preserve that meaning, this is how you now do it. Similarly, the HR tag has often just meant, oh, well, it's just a horizontal rule, it's something that's just presentational. However, it's used often enough, such as in books, to mean a thematic break between paragraphs, that's what it's now defined to mean. Of course, it could have a presentation of being a horizontal rule, or perhaps you could change the presentation of the HR and replace it with a nice little background image of a little flourish, whatever makes sense for your content. If there aren't any places where you have thematic breaks between paragraphs, that's okay. You don't need to use it, but it's there now if you want to. In this next section, I'm going to discuss some of the pieces of markup that were either in HTML4 and deprecated mistakenly, as it turns out, or some pieces that were never actually picked up and incorporated in any specs at all. In particular, these features all worked cross-browser. And when I say worked, I mean good enough that people coded with them, put on their websites, didn't actually have to do any kind of sniffing or anything, just use them day in, day out. Either they didn't make it into the spec, or they got deprecated mistakenly. In some cases, people came to the wrong conclusion. That's okay. We all make mistakes, even spec writers, and it's good to acknowledge those mistakes and fix them. So the first one is iframe. Now, you might be wondering, well, why didn't I just use object? Well, it turns out that there's enough of a difference in the way that objects are treated. They're almost always external plugins or applets from a permissions model and a security model that it makes sense to keep the iframe as having this special meaning of like, yes, it's like an object, but we're saying it's just embedded HTML. It has a very different implication, just like saying something is an image. It has a different implication than just saying it's an object. So the iframe is now valid HTML5 markup. This is a big one. HTML5 finally acknowledges that plugins deserve a tag that works cross-browser and works predictably and works well. The embed tag, which most websites today seem to use to embed either Flash or QuickTime, sometimes other plugins, is now a valid part of HTML5. And the nice thing is that HTML5 defines how authors should use it and defines how browsers should implement it so that any small discrepancies they may have had can now be worked out and we can just author consistently. The target attribute is one that was hotly debated because it was often seen as something presentational. Not only that, it was seen as something that was actually bad for the user interface because, well, no one likes pop-up windows, right? Well, it turns out that most of those annoying pop-up windows don't come from the target attribute, but rather come from JavaScript. So the target attribute itself indicating the semantic that, yes, I want the destination of this link to actually load in a separate window or in a separate iframe, for example, which we just acknowledged was valid, is now accepted in HTML5. So that means you can use it as part of the base tag or the A tag or the area tag. All these forms of hyperlinking now can direct their documents at a specific destination. The last set of HTML5 black sheep that have now been acknowledged is that of list numbering. The value attribute on the list element was deprecated mistakenly in HTML4. It was assumed to be presentational, but it turns out that for various applications, legal applications, perhaps you're displaying a list 10 items at a time across different pages, the value attribute is quite useful and should never have been deprecated. So now it's in HTML5. Parallel to the value attribute, the start attribute on an ordered list element. So sometimes you start a list from number 1, right? But oftentimes, like I said with pagination, if you're going to the second page of a list of 100 items that you're displaying 10 at a time, you need your list to start at number 11, right? So this is where you use the ordered list start attribute, say start equals 11, and then you can move on from there. It's an accepted part of HTML5. Another thing that we've seen in the past 10 years is this incredible amount of use of dynamic content in pages. And what dynamic content means is that sometimes a portion of a page just doesn't have anything to fill in. So you might have an ordered list of items or an unordered list of items that is completely dynamically generated. That is, has no content directly that's static or from the server without the user interacting. Fortunately now, instead of having to use a div for that, you can actually use a semantic list to indicate, hey, something's going to go here, but for now it's empty. And you can have 0 items in an ordered list or an unordered list. I figured I would slip in one new feature here for you guys, which is that ordered lists now can count backwards. I know you're thinking, well, what a big deal, right? Well, if you're posting a top 10 list, for example, now you can simply use the reverse attribute to start and the start attribute to start your list at 10 and count it down all the way to 1. This brings us to the last notable change from HTML4 to HTML5, and that is some of the restrictions to the site element. In particular, what's happened is, well, in HTML4, it provided 2 distinct uses of the site element. One was to cite various works, titles, like if you were to cite HTML5 now. Well, HTML4 also allowed cite to be used for speaker names. Not everything that you want to quote, for example, has a source in print that you can cite. Sometimes you're just quoting a speaker and you just put their name. This was used often. It's in HTML4 examples and it's all over the web. HTML5, unfortunately, has constrained the cite element, at least the current HTML5, to only the title of a work. And it explicitly disallowed the use for people that previously was allowed. Well, this is not something that everyone agrees with. And so I'm actually going to give you a recommendation here that works with HTML4 and works with, let's say, the spirit of HTML5, but not necessarily the letter right now. which is to use the site element for speakers, but to mark them up with HCard microformat so that you can indicate this is a site for a person and not a site for a title or a work. Here's an example. A quote tag, the best way to predict the future is to invent it. And that was said by Alan Kay. I don't know if he actually said that in print anywhere, but as far as I know, he was the person that said it. So rather than omitting that semantic information, I'm using the site element here with an HCard, it starts with class equals vcard, and a class of fn to indicate that that's his full name, his full formatted name, to indicate that this site is a speaker that's a person. I encourage you to do this, and this is what modern web designers have been doing for quite some time and will continue to do so. Not only modern web designers, but it turns out millions of real-world web pages actually use cite for speakers. What kind of web pages are citing all these speakers? Well, for example, blog comments. If you look at popular WordPress themes, they list all the blog comments. Every commentary is marked up with a cite because that's the semantically right thing to do. So what I encourage you to do is to add your voice. If you're a web designer or developer and in pursuing semantic markup, use these techniques. This is starting to get into the area where you can start contributing to HTML5. This is a wiki page on the What Working Group wiki, specifically about the site element, documenting these kind of uses. The nice thing about HTML5 is it is still a bit in flux, and it's also based on gathering evidence. If we gather enough evidence, this is a part of the spec that we may be able to actually get changed. Maybe not in this version, maybe it'll be in a 5.01. We're not sure. In either case, contribute to the spec and help it evolve in a good direction. So, notable changes to HTML4. In summary, we have new specific semantic details with M and strong. M now means emphasis, you can nest it. Strong now means importance. The following elements that used to be purely presentational have been redefined to be semantic, which is a wonderful boon to all of us. Small, for small print, whether it's copyright, disclaimers, etc., things that often go in a footer, right? I, for taxonomic terms and other such sort of changes of voice in some text. The B tag is now used for stylistic offset text. BR, finally we can mark up our poetry properly and semantically, including line breaks where they were intended. And HR for thematic breaks between paragraphs. HTML5 accepts as now being okay the iframe and embed elements, as well as the value and start attributes for lists. Finally, HTML5 makes a little bit of a misstep here with the cite element, and to work around that, we recommend that when you're using the cite element for marking up speakers, use it with the HCard microformat so that you're clearly indicating, especially to browsers that support it and any other user agent or search engine that supports it, that you mean a person. There's several areas that HTML5 actually simplifies and makes it easier not only to learn HTML, but to also remember and use HTML. And these involve better flexibility, more universality, and better consistency. In particular, we're going to talk about how hyperlinks and blocks have become more flexible. Global attributes are now applicable to more elements. And the A and area elements have some minor fixes that make them more consistent, which is nice. Hyperlinks and blocks. This is a really common thing that web developers have done, even accidentally, for a long time. And that is that the A element can now surround blocks. For example, post headings. I'm sure many of you have written a blog or written a blog post that you've linked your heading to the permalink of the blog post itself. For example, here is Andy Clark's blog, stuffandnonsense.co.uk, and he's written an article here in a section about HTML and microformats called Keep Calm and Carry On with HTML5. This is a heading, and it links to a blog post, permalink, and you can also notice that the image next to it also links to that blog post. But because of the nesting rules of HTML4, you have to put links inside headings. This is weird block inline stuff they came up with that, as far as I know, has just confused web designers since they first introduced it. In HTML5, you can actually put the anchor tag, the hyperlink, around the heading, and this gives you the advantage of twofold. First, the entire heading is linked, not just the text. Second, if there's images or text or content near the heading that you also want to link to the same post, in this case we've got an image, then you can expand your hyperlink to contain both that image and the heading itself as well. So here's a code example of how you would do that. Again, if you're using this for the blog post, you want to use the semantic rel attribute and indicate that you're actually linking to something that's bookmarkable. Global attributes. It's much easier when you know that certain attributes can apply to all elements. In particular, what HTML5 did is it changed the class, dir, ID, lang, style, tab index, and title attributes to always apply to all elements. And you might be wondering, wait a minute, when did they not apply to all elements? Well, in HTML4, there were a few odd cases here and there that if you forgot and you used the class in the wrong place or an ID in the wrong place, your document would be invalid. None of these cases made any sense to forbid. So HTML5 allows them. They now make sense. In particular, I'm going to show you a really simple example where you might have come across this. Here's a little bit of code that if I was going to create a really simple contact page, I might actually just title it, with my name. And then I might have something in the body that says, go ahead and my website is, and then link to it. And maybe I would just include the domain rather than putting the full HTTP ref. Close body. If I wanted to turn this really simple document into an HCard, for example, I would have to figure out, well, where do I put the root class name vcard? Where do I put the FN and all that? And the answer is that, well, since the only place that my name shows up is in the title element, what I would have to do is actually put the class name on the root element, in this case, the HTML element. You can now do this in HTML5, whereas you couldn't in HTML4. And similarly, with the title element, I would say class equals FN to indicate that, yes, that's my full formatted name. Finally, the last bit I would say, class equals URL, to indicate that that is the URL that can go with my contact information. Next, just a little bit more consistency with the use of the A tag and the area tags. The media attribute has finally been added to both A and area, just like the link elements media attribute. You're probably wondering, well, I don't think I was missing that. How would I use that? Why would I have needed to use that? Well, if you use a site like Twitter, or use a mobile phone, or use some other websites that have mobile versions, you might have found that there's little hyperlinks in the bottom of those sites, or sometimes in the corner, that say, click here to go to the mobile site. Well, what you can do now in your markup is actually indicate that explicitly and say, here is the mobile site or mobile page equivalent for the current page that you're on. And the way you do that is twofold. First, you have to say rel equals alternate, which is part of HTML4 and completely valid to use already, which you should be doing. But you can indicate that it's meant for mobile with media equals handheld. Okay. Similarly, if you're developing for a print publication, perhaps a newspaper, perhaps a magazine that has a website, and you want to offer print versions of your articles, maybe you already do, you probably have a link to the article, the print version, that says, here, click here for the print version. In this case, similarly, you should be using rel equals alternate to mark up the link as an alternate version of the current page, current documents. And now you can say media equals print to indicate semantically that this hyperlink goes to a print version of the current page or site. Now, you might think these are really small changes, and they are pretty minor, but what it does enable is that if you've got a browser on a mobile device that's configured to automatically load the mobile version of a site, it can now do so by discovering the mobile version on a page simply by finding the media rel alternate that is a media handheld in a hyperlink and not just in a link element. Similarly, if you go to print a page, smarter browsers could offer you the option of loading the print version and printing that rather than just printing the page that you're viewing directly. Next, the area element, which hasn't been used that much because not a lot of folks use image maps. Still, it's nice to make it consistent because the more that the markup aspects are consistent, the easier they are to learn. In this case, the area element gets an hreflang and a rel attribute, similarly to the A element. Pretty minor, hreflang indicates what the language of the destination document is. In most cases, it's the same language, but sometimes it's different. You can now use that. And the rel attribute, of course, indicates what the relation of the target document is to the current document or large portion thereof. So it's potentially additional use of rel for microformats, but I haven't found much practical use for this. Still, it's a nice simplification, and it's good to see that HTML5 is displaying the details nicely like this. So in summary, HTML5 has made some key features more flexible, more universal, and more consistent that make aspects of markup easier for web developers to learn and remember. In particular, hyperlinks can now surround blocks. A wonderful bit of flexibility. Should have been there from the beginning. The following attributes are now universal and can be applied to all elements: class, dir, ID, lang, style, tab index, and title. And finally, there's consistent link attributes between media and rel and hreflang. They all work on both the A element and the area element. Now that we've seen all the changes from HTML4 to HTML5, there's one little piece that was used and adapted from XHTML 1.1 into HTML5, which is kind of nice. So all that work on the XHTML path there wasn't all for naught. And that is the Ruby element and its descendants. So the Ruby element, first of all, nothing to do with the programming language Ruby. Nothing at all. This has to do with annotating East Asian text. In particular, oftentimes you have some East Asian text that has a longer expansion. And I'll show you an example of that soon. There's two more tags that it encompasses. One is the RT tag, which stands for the Ruby text annotation itself. And just to be clear, it's not for Twitter retweets. And the RP tag, which stands for Ruby parentheses. When you put a Ruby in plain text, you have to actually use parentheses to demarcate the Ruby text annotation. This isn't the most ideal way to lay it out, but what it does do is give us a nice little hook for fallback behavior, and the RP tag is there for that purpose. So let me show you an example of Ruby markup for Japanese, actually, that has a hiragana expansion of kanji characters. The following is a complete Ruby example with an open Ruby tag, closed Ruby tag, some kanji characters, and the RP tags around the parentheses, the RT around the Ruby text hiragana expansion itself. So if you were to see this in a browser that supports Ruby, this is what it would look like. What you see is in the ellipses before and after, indicating other content, you see the kanji characters, and then you see the expansions above them of the hiragana that's used to represent the kanji. And this is a common enough East Asian typographical technique that it's nice that it's been included in HTML5, and it's nice that it reuses XHTML 1.1. Let me continue with this example and show you what it looks like in browsers that don't support the Ruby element. So we call that fallback, what happens in non-Ruby supporting browsers. And there you see, everything's about the same size. You see the kanji character, then followed immediately by the Ruby text annotation, the expansions in hiragana, with the parentheses visible. Note that because the browser in this case doesn't support the Ruby or the RP tags, it just ignores them and renders it as plain text. This is an exceptionally well-designed feature that came from XHTML 1.1, and it's really great that's being reused. In summary, the HTML5 Ruby feature, it's very useful for East Asian typography, and that's really good to know, especially if you're doing any work on East Asian sites. It works in IE, actually, and in WebKit browsers today, and this is really kind of amazing. Here's a little bit of trivia. It's actually worked in IE for 10 years. This is one of the few features of HTML5 that actually worked in IE first, got adopted by the standards bodies at around the same time in XHTML 1.1, recently supported by WebKit, just last year implemented. The nice thing is, even in browsers that don't support it, there's graceful fallback. There's also mentions in various discussion boards that Mozilla and Gecko will be supporting it very soon. Once that happens, it's only natural for Opera to follow, because Opera rarely likes to be left behind when web standards are concerned. My recommendation to you, use it. Go ahead. It's got sufficient benefits when it works in browsers. There's sufficient browsers that do support it, i.e. numerous mobile devices that use WebKit, etc. And when browsers don't support it, it still looks fine. So go ahead and use this. Enhance your East Asian text with Rubies and feel confident that it'll work, or at least look pretty good. Now that you've updated your existing HTML4 and XHTML content, take into account the changes in HTML5, and perhaps even added Ruby support to those places that you can use it. Maybe even added some of the more nuanced features of HTML5, refined semantics. It's time to validate your changes. So, first of all, there's a new validator that's been in development to help spur and encourage both the development of HTML5 itself and folks to publish HTML5 pages on the web, because being able to validate something is an important part of being able to author it. That's validator.nu. Fortunately, there's also a new favlet that you can drag and drop and install to one-click validate your pages with this new validator. And that's what I'm going to do right now. So if you go to favlets.com, you'll see a page fairly close to this one. And what you want is you want the HTML5 validator. So if you go and hover over that, you can see it turns blue, and drag it into your toolbar, drop it, you'll get a little dialog box saying HTML5 validator. Go ahead and say OK, type a name for that, and there it is in our toolbar. Now, go to a website, say for example, a website of like a web design consultancy. I think the guys at clearleft.com do a really good job, so let's go check out their site. And to validate, whether on your site or someone else's site, all you have to do is click the one-click validator favlet, and it uses validator.nu, as you can see from the URL, and validates the page. In this case, it's been checked, being served as text HTML, it's being validated as HTML5 plus ARIA, and the document validates. The guys at ClearLeft are doing a great job and have made their site validate with HTML5. Excellent. And you can too, and you should. If you're hiring someone to do HTML5 work for you, now you know how to check if their website themselves validates as HTML5. And if a web design consultancy's website doesn't validate as HTML5, probably shouldn't be hiring them to do HTML5 work for you. So let that be a call to action to all those out there who want to be web designers and professional web developers that are working on HTML5. Update your sites, because not only should you be checking if they're valid, but your peers and your customers and clients will be checking to see if you can get things right yourself before deciding to hire you or not. Nice thing is that the W3C validator now also supports HTML5. So you can go, if you like, instead to validator.w3.org and use that validator as well. But back to a personal level, what you want to do is verify that all of your changes validate. And that's important. Always make sure that your code works before harshing on anyone else's. Make any necessary fixes and revalidate. Again, using the one-click validator, it's fairly easy to do so. Now that you've made any necessary fixes to your content so that it validates as HTML5, what next? Well, congratulations. You've upgraded your existing markup to HTML5. Well done. If you want to refer to any changes, check out the HTML4 differences document. But otherwise, you're now ready to learn new HTML5 features. So let's get right to them. The next section of new semantic elements in HTML5 covers figures, marks, and dates. Figure is a relatively new semantic element, or rather, certainly one that's seen some amount of turmoil and updating. Right now, figure is paired with another element called fig caption. The idea is that you have all these images or movies or other figures, frankly, that have a description or a caption next to them, perhaps below, like figure 6, or a graph you can imagine that would have a description of what the axes mean would be the description. In these cases, it really helps to semantically link the two. In fact, you could even use it for the aforementioned case of an image with a long description, rather than having it in an invisible attribute, instead having the long description in a figure caption. The next semantic element that HTML5 adds is the mark element. And while this is an element that is not that commonly used, there are some key uses that made it significant enough to be worthy of inclusion. In particular, it's for marking up, so to speak, highlighted runs of text. For example, when you load a page in a search engine or through a search engine, a lot of sites know that you got there from that search engine and know what word or words you were searching for, and often highlight those words in their page to help you find what you were looking for. That would be a perfect example for when you would use the mark element to mark up those little highlighted segments, and you may perhaps use different colors because you're indicating that semantic that yeah, this is a run of text that the users selected or searched for. The last element that we're talking about in this section is a time element. And the time element represents a lot of opportunity and actually a lot of challenge as well simultaneously. It was originally developed a while ago, a couple of years ago in fact, to help work around some of the challenges that we've been encountering in the microformats community with marking up dates and times. Specifically, when you mark up a time and a date in the ISO 8601 format, it's oftentimes not the most readable thing. And so the time element was created to separate out the human readable version of the date and time and the machine readable version so that we could mark these up without interfering with the user experience at all. However, it's got some limitations, and those have been documented. It's for precise dates and date times. And let me explain what that means. So this means that you can only mark up a specific day. For example, you can mark up 2010 April 8th, but you can't mark up 2010 April, which would be a specific month with a time element. You also can't mark up just a specific year, like 2010. And these are common enough use cases on the web. Plenty of blog archive pages that are archives by year, that have archives by month. People mention times of years and months in common conversation or in blog posts as well, that it's kind of curious that this was omitted from the time element. In addition, the date and time combination version of the time element has its own challenges, and that is that while you can specify the fully human readable version inside a time element, you still have to use that not as friendly ISO 8601 date and time combined format. And let me show you an example of that, and let me show you what we can do to actually try and use the time element yet again, going back to that blog post from Jeremy Keith. So here you see in the footer, he's got the time of a post marked up with a paragraph, which is fine. What we're going to do is instead, we're going to actually put a time element, and he actually has it around this abbreviation tag. So we're going to put it closest to that. We're going to say time, mark up that whole thing. This is a specific date and time. And then go in and use the date time attribute to indicate the ISO date time. In this case, he's already got it for us there in that abbreviation. So we're going to copy this and paste it in there. Okay. So this is an example use of the time element. Now, the problems here are at least twofold. The first is that we're duplicating, actually in this case, triplicating the content. Whenever you duplicate content, you run the risk of it going out of sync, especially when it's in two significantly different formats. In fact, in this instance alone, we take a close look and we might realize, hey, wait a minute, this blog post says it was posted at 5:43 p.m. However, the timestamp says 5:43 a.m. If this was supposed to be 5:33 p.m., it should say 17 here. So let's go ahead and fix that. And it's good that we caught that. However, that's an example of exactly what happens when you violate what programmers call the DRY principle. The DRY principle stands for DRY, don't repeat yourself. Programmers follow this principle because they know that when you do repeat yourself, the data tends to diverge, and you end up between humans seeing one thing, machines seeing another, confusion, chaos. So in this case, I'm going to actually show you what we do with microformats in line with the time element at the same time to solve this problem. So the first thing we do is we remove this completely from the title here, attribute, because of the fact that that ISO date and time is not particularly readable or listenable to most folks. In this case, we don't even need the abbreviation element at all for the whole thing. So let's mark up the date and time separately. I'm going to put a span here and say title equals 2009-12-13. Fortunately, that's something that people can read. In fact, the date format of YYYY-MM-DD is an ISO 8601 standard international date format that happens to also be the most readable and understandable and listenable date format around the world. You might think, well, it looks kind of strange to me. I'm not used to hearing 2009, 12, 13. I'm used to hearing December 13th. Sure. To English-speaking audiences, that's absolutely correct. December 13th is more understandable than 2009, 12, 13. We're reading it that way. However, when you think worldwide, not everyone understands or reads and writes English, but people do understand numbers. Numbers are more universal than natural human languages, so this format tends to be the most readable. Let's go ahead and mark up the time as well. Just to illustrate that you can mark these both up separately. Now what we're going to do is explain how this fits in the world of microformats. This blog post, one of the ways to mark it up is with the HATM blog format or microformat. I'm not going to go ahead and do that right now. What I am going to do though is show you just for this piece how you would do that, which is first of all to take the overall container element and say class equals published. That's one of the properties of HATM. If you want to learn more about HATM and microformats, I strongly recommend you pick up a nice reference or a nice tutorial, like Microformats Made Simple by Emily Lewis, or Designing with Microformats by Andy Clark. In this case, we're using what's called the value class pattern to separately specify the date and the time. So what we need to do in that case, though, is actually turn these back into abbreviations, because that's how the value class pattern will know to pick it up, because it's an abbreviation with the additional class name of value. So we're going to do that to both the separate date and the separate time. In this way, when a user potentially hovers over the date, sees the tooltip, they're going to see an internationally readable, human readable date for the date and an internationally readable time for the time, as well as because this paragraph contains all the date and time information, and microformats through the value class pattern can combine that separate date and separate time. Now we've got this wonderful combination of the date is in one place here together and the time is here as well. One of the things I would like to see for the time element to really be usable is to allow this kind of separation of date and time, because then you can start doing interesting things like, for example, 5:43 p.m. is actually a syntax that's supported in the value class pattern. So I can switch this from being ABBR to being a span and eliminate this title, because I know that the value class pattern will parse 5:43 p.m. The other thing that you can do is you have the option of saying, hey, you know what? Because I want international readers of my blog to understand the date and time of the year, I can actually replace that and put it inline. In this case, we don't need a title attribute at all. Notice what we just did. We just simplified the date and time to being in one place inside a class equals value for the date and the same thing for the time. We actually have solved the dry principle violation here, except for the time element. So my hope is that the time element can be enhanced to allow this kinds of date and time separation, and therefore allow dates and times to be properly and easily published and reliably published. These issues and more are documented on the What Working Group wiki about the time element. Again, HTML5, it's not a done deal, right? It's still a draft that's in progress. So while there are certain areas that are very stable, that are very usable, like the changes to HTML4, and even some of these new semantic elements like section and header, footer, and nav, I would say those are really stable. Go ahead and use them. Others, like figure and fig caption, were recently updated and changed. You can try using those, but I'm actually advising that you just pay attention to them, maybe not quite start using them yet, because some of these have changed just even months ago. Fig caption didn't exist. We used to be using legend or potentially DT and DD to indicate the different portions of a figure. So who knows if this is going to keep changing or not. Finally, regarding date time, that's something that In some discrete cases you can use, in others you can't. Now that you've updated your content, transitioned it from HTML4 or XHTML to HTML5, and validated it, double check that everything works and comes out squeaky clean green, let's go ahead and learn some new HTML5 features, specifically semantics. The nice thing about the new semantics in HTML5 is that for the first time in the history of HTML, at least, the new semantic tags were based on studying existing designer and developer use of class names, of semantic class names. Since about the year 2000, web designers and developers have been pushing the edges of HTML by making up their own semantics and capturing them with class names instead of new elements. So what the folks that have designed HTML5 did is studied the millions of web pages out there, perhaps even billions, that had semantic markup in them, looked at class names and found out, well, what's the most common one? Turns out almost every web designer or developer develops some conventions for standardized page structure, and a lot of them happen to have picked a lot of the same terms. So some of these terms, fortunately, have been reused in both articles and heading groups, and also some of the newer features include figures, marks, and dates. So let's talk about the most common one, which is page structure. Almost every web page that's on the web today is sufficiently filled with content that it's broken up into one or more different sections. And a lot of web developers actually use class name equals section to demarcate these different sections of content. So it's hard to even talk about it without even using the word section. So the spec defines section as being a thematic grouping of content. That's fine. We all understand what that means. It's another building block for us. The nice thing about section and what makes it different from a div is that it actually captures some of its specific discrete structures with more semantic elements. The first of those is a header. So every section potentially has a header where there's content like headings or navigation or anything else, an introduction that takes that up. Speaking of navigation, most web developers are now using unordered lists of hyperlinks to indicate, hey, this is a set of navigation links for this page or this section of this page. And a lot of them happen to be saying class equals nav. Well, nav has been promoted to being its own element now. So that's the way you indicate that a section contains hyperlinks for navigation. This is useful in several ways. First, it indicates to a browser that the area of links that it's looking at is not necessarily content per se, but for navigation. Right? What this means is that newer browsers can actually look at that and say, hey, I can offer a skipping navigation option. Right? Accessibility tools can recognize the list of links are meant for navigation across a site or between pages in a site rather than just being embed hyperlinks. If there's a header, there's almost certainly a footer. Sections almost always have an area at the bottom that either contains like small print or copyright information or perhaps comments, something else that means like, okay, well, this is just the bottom of the section. It's after the main content area. Moving on, articles. Articles are a self-contained post, perhaps a news article, perhaps a story, blogs, anything that seems like it's a self-contained chunk of content that could stand on its own, perhaps on its own page even, but happens to be included on a page, maybe with other pieces of content. That qualifies as an article. In fact, article is a special type of section. It's got all the same properties and attributes the section does, and that it can also contain a header and a footer and its own navigation. So let's go ahead and do a simple exercise where we take a blog post and update it to use a few of these new semantics. I'm going to go to Jeremy Keith's blog where he wrote recently about watching and keeping up with HTML5. He says, full-time job if you're subscribed to all these mailing lists. It is a lot of work. But we're not here to read the content of his blog, which is quite excellent. We're here to look at the source. So if we look at his source, we do a view source, we can see that, aha, he's even putting some comments for us. He says, I see you want to peek at the source code. It's a great thing about the web, reverse engineering. I don't know about you, but this is how I learned a lot about HTML, which is view source, and then copy, paste, and modify, and teach myself things. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's start with Jeremy's body here, or body tag at least, and copy a little bit, perhaps down to just before the main content. And let's copy that over to our document here with our nice HTML5 doc type and meta charset. Paste that in and go ahead and figure out, well, okay, we've got this content. What are the new semantic elements that we just discussed could we add here? One more thing about section. I said articles were a special type of section. The body is also. The body tag is what we call another sectioning element. So that means you can include a header and a footer and nav inside the body element, and they maintain all those same semantics. So clearly here, he's talking about a logo, his navigation, all that. This is all material that belongs inside a header. So we can put a header element there. And how far down does it go? Looks like all of this content belongs in the header. So let's go ahead and do that. And what else can we add? Okay, he's got a logo, has pictures. Here's the nav. Here's a perfect example of where you could add a nav element to indicate semantically that this section contains navigation links. Great. What else could we do? I think for just this part of the content, that's good enough. We've added a bit of semantics without having to actually change in the existing content at all. And in fact, notice that around the navigation, he's already got a div tag, which he's using with the ID of navigation. That's okay. We've got a nav tag, he's used ID navigation, 6 of one, half dozen of the other. Let's go back to his source and keep looking. What else is there here? Here's the main content. Oh, great. That's the section we're looking for. So let's copy from there down to, let's see, how far does the content go? Keeps going, keeps going. It's a good long blog post. And this looks like footer type material. He's talking about the time. Why don't we go ahead and trim it there? Copy that. Go back to our source code view, put some space in, paste that in. Okay, here's the main content. Now, in HTML5, there really isn't a tag to indicate main or main content, despite the fact that this is a very commonly used concept across web pages. What it came down to is there weren't any specific significant semantics added by something being called main. In this case, if we want, we could perhaps use the section element to indicate, okay, well, this is a major section of content. Let's call it a section, right? So let's call that a section. Oh, wait, however, well, what do we have here? We really have a blog post. Now, in HTML5, as in HTML4, you ought to use the most semantically precise and appropriate element for the specific use case. In this case, an article, which is a special type of section, is actually more appropriate because this is an article. So let's go ahead and replace that section with an article. Great. Now we've got an article here, and let's mark up the specific pieces of it. We start with, looks like the header and the heading. The heading's already marked up, so let's just mark that as a header of the article. And now we've got his markup in the article itself. I don't think there's anything there that we need to touch. Great. And here at the bottom, it's the timestamp for when the article was posted. This is the kind of information you would find in a footer. So let's go ahead and mark that up as a footer. Great. And now we've added a little bit of HTML5 semantics to Jeremy's blog post. There's a few more semantic elements that have been derived from common usage. One of those is the aside element for, like you would think, tangential comments, perhaps side content. You know, you see a magazine article that has a main article, maybe has a little sidebar of content or articles. You can use it for things like that. I think this element used to be called sidebar, but that has such a presentational connotation to it that over the course of discussions in the working group, they came up with the term aside, which is a nice, non-presentation specific semantic name for this content. It's pretty good. It's not going to apply probably in a lot of situations, but if you do post blog posts or articles with tangential content, little side notes, the aside element is what you want to use there. The next new semantic element that HTML5 introduces is hgroup. And hgroup is meant for many situations where you end up actually clustering headings, like a heading and a subhead, and you want them to be semantically connected together. So Let's take a look at an example that we had from before that actually had a heading and a subhead, which we already started to mark up with some of the additional HTML5 semantic elements. This is from the title of this video, which is HTML5 Now, step-by-step video tutorial. Obviously, it's a heading and a subhead. In this case, all we need to do to use the hgroup element is to wrap the whole thing in hgroup and close hgroup. What this indicates is that semantically, the two headings are linked. And so if a browser or some other user agent, maybe a search engine, maybe an indexer, is going to display, like, say, an outline of the document using the headings as keys into the outline, it's telling that program that these two headings actually belong together and shouldn't actually be separated out into separate levels or separate sections. The nice thing is, all these new tags, they're actually already stylable in modern browsers. Well, for the most part, except for Internet Explorer, unfortunately. Internet Explorer up through version 8 does not allow styling of these new elements because it doesn't recognize them. However, as of Internet Explorer 9, current preview, we're able to style all the new semantic elements that I just described to you, which is great news. It means that hopefully in a few years, you'll be able to actually depend on them. Well, we don't have a few years, or rather, we don't want to wait a few years. So we're going to use a technique that we've had to use as web developers and designers in the past, which is nested divs with semantic class names. In this case, though, rather than using nested divs to work around box model problems, which is one of the original reasons that this technique was developed back in the early 2000s, we're going to use nested divs to keep the semantics in two places, fortunately next to each other, with the new tags like article, for example, and using a div with that same element name, or at least something similar as the class name. So this technique that we're using here, we're doing because we want the markup to be recognized by both new modern HTML5 browsers and still work with existing browsers. And is really employing a technique that's one part of what I would call bulletproof HTML5. This notion of bulletproof web development and web design was really first introduced by Dan Cederholm in his book, Bulletproof Web Design. And it's really taken off quite a bit because people understand what it means to build web design that works across a variety of situations, whether or not a feature is supported, whether or not a device has a certain resolution, depending on window size, etc. So depending on the area, the overall methodology is still the same, which is to allow for flexibility in the user's environment and to essentially bulletproof your design to make it work across more environments. In fact, this technique was applied to the realm of JavaScript and Ajax as well. Jeremy Keith published a similar book on Bulletproof Ajax, where he describes how to create nice dynamic websites that use Ajax to update portions of the screen that gracefully degrades even in browsers without JavaScript, that work in browsers without JavaScript, specifically by making sure that whatever you code for creating those dynamic areas, you also code to properly handle the content if you have to generate everything on the back end. So this technique we're showing you here will work whether or not you have HTML5 compatible browser or not. So what you have to do, like I said, use the nested div, and then the key piece is using the CSS to style the div that's nested rather than the element itself, filing .article instead of just article itself. And that'll work in all modern browsers. So from a CSS perspective, because you can't depend on these new elements being styled across all browsers, you have to style the inner div. So let's take a look at one of our examples, like the hgroup. If I want to style that hgroup reliably, what I should do is instead put a whole div around this whole thing. Div class equals hgroup, similarly. And the easiest thing to do is just to pick the same class name as the element itself so that it's obvious, both to you and to anyone else that's maintaining the code, what you're doing, this bulletproof HTML5 technique. And there you go. If we want to style that hgroup, we would use the class selector as shown here in the presentation. So in summary, we've learned a lot of new semantic elements here. To keep them in mind, the common ones that you'll probably find yourself using are section, header, nav, footer. Almost every page you design for the web will likely include these elements. Sometimes you might even have nested sections with their own little headers and footers. It's exactly why these elements were introduced, so that that additional document structure could be represented nice and cleanly and semantically. Many pages on the web represent articles or blog posts, news articles, even tweets. All of these really count as articles and therefore make sense to be marked up as such. Some of them have related comment or related content or tangential content, and those should be marked up with the aside. In addition, if you're one of those folks that uses headings and subheadings, once in a while, that's a good time to use the H-group element to collect those up and cluster them together. Finally, we talked about figures and fig captions, marks, and the date and time element. Time element here is really good, I would say, in short, for dates. So if you want to specify just a complete date, like 2010, 04, 08, for example, then go ahead and use the time element. It'll parse that out. That'll work great. If you want to use it for dates and times, then you have to start worrying about providing a human-readable date and time, and then the less human-friendly ISO date time in the date time attribute of the time element. It can be a little confusing, and I think it's not the best designed element in HTML5, but it's still got some uses. Be aware of the limitations, and if you have additional use cases for the time element that doesn't quite seem to work for right now, please contribute to the wiki page. Now that you've learned a great deal about the new semantic elements that are in HTML5, you've done basically the equivalent of eating your broccoli. You've eaten the proper nutritious semantic goodness, and now it's time for some juicy vector graphics. Some of these bits and pieces that I know you've probably seen demos about, we're going to actually code a little bit ourselves. Where does HTML5's native vector graphics come from? Well, it comes from two sources. The first is SVG, which is W3C's vector graphic markup language. W3C has been developing SVG for quite some time. It's the result of years of collaboration and working together between companies like Adobe, with their experience long-term in vector formats such as PDF, PostScript, Display PostScript, all of that, and Microsoft as well, with their experience doing vector graphics and their own attempts at an XML-based vector graphics language like VML. So over years of experience, they came together, they developed SVG, it's based on XML, and it actually has some degree of support, which is external images. And external images that are in SVG are used widely throughout Wikipedia. I have an example of one of these here for you that shows you a symbol that's used actually on the article for science on Wikipedia. SVG is used when you want to create a graphic, a single graphic that scales to arbitrary resolution. In many cases, a lot of folks use things like Flash as well to embed graphics, but these days most browsers support SVG, so more and more folks are using SVG to embed vector graphics into their markup. The other piece of the vector graphics puzzle for HTML5 is Canvas, and this is quite exciting because what happened here was Apple decided to use HTML and CSS to support the little applications that they have on their platform for their dashboard layer. And making these applications based on web standards was one of the first times that a platform vendor has really done so honestly and heartedly. And one of the limitations they ran up against was that there was no good drawing language in HTML. So they invented the Canvas element, which so many other browser vendors found useful, that was quickly implemented in Firefox and Opera as well. And so all these companies already working together, like we talked about in the background history section, on the web applications, decided to incorporate Canvas into HTML5. So let's take a look at a really simple Canvas example. Here's a simple example of two overlapping squares. So we're going to do the time-honored tradition. We're going to view source, go ahead and copy that. Yeah, it is that small an example. And switch to our text editor, paste it in, save it, go ahead and drag it in, and see if that works. Yep, still works for us, great. So let's go ahead in here and take a look at what's going on. Well, we've got a title. Everyone understands what a title works like. We've also got the script here, The script tag is what's doing the work. Okay, we've got a drawing function that we keep looking down here, body, on load, it calls the draw function. All right, what's the draw function doing? Let's step through it. The first thing it does is it calls document.getElementById and looks for the element called example1 with the ID example1. If we take a look at the body, there's one element, canvas, with that ID. It's got a width and it's got a height. And it has fallback text as well, which anytime you have image or graphics, you ought to have some form of fallback content. In this case, it just says 2 overlapping squares. All right, so we've gotten the canvas element. If canvas.getContext, what's this doing? This is basically calling on the method on the canvas object that got retrieved from getElementById to see if that method even exists. If it does exist, then it calls canvas.getContext with an actual parameter. What's it really doing here? What it's just doing is it's testing to see if the browser supports Canvas. If the browser supports Canvas, then this will return a non-zero defined result. We'll continue the code. But in a browser like IE, it'll return undefined, and therefore we won't execute any of this code. So in a browser like WebKit, we call canvas.getContext. We ask for the 2D context. There's some work on a 3D context as well, but for now, we're just going to talk about the 2D context because that's what's ready and usable. We assign that to a variable. We set its fill style to an RGB color. Then we call fillRect with top left and dimensions. And then we call another fill style. We change the fill style color to another color with a little bit of an alpha channel. So we get some transparency. And then we call another fillRect, a slightly different location, but again, the same size, same width and height, a square. And the end result, as you see, is a square, 2 overlapping squares. Let's go ahead and see if we can modify this code, which is one of the best ways to learn when you copy and paste an example. Let's just go ahead and copy and paste that and go in here, and we've already got a red and a green, so why don't we create a blue? Blue, simple blue, be 0, 0, 255. And let's make this 50% opaque so that it's still somewhat transparent. And following this pattern that the other squares are doing, let's put this at 96, 96, and keep it the same width and height. Save. All right, let's go to our browser, reload. Wow, doesn't that look pretty? We just added another square. That didn't take much work at all. And that's one of the beauties of this copy and paste view source coding style. You can take a simple example, modify it, get some effect immediately, and have that satisfaction. The great thing is, I'm going to walk you through some of the other browsers here and show you that in Firefox, looks about the same. Opera looks about the same. Great. So what we've just demonstrated, oh look, one more browser, Google Chrome. How about that one? Same result. So what you're seeing here is that we've actually got consistent support for Canvas across major browsers. In fact, all browsers except IE, and I'll get to that later. If you want to read more about how the Canvas element works, how to expand upon it, other drawing primitives, I recommend that you check out the excellent tutorials that are online, starting with the Mozilla basic usage of the Canvas element tutorial. So how far can we take the Canvas element, right? When people first got the opportunity to create new web applications, what did they do? Well, anyone ever used that old application on Windows, MS Paint? Yeah, I can see what you're thinking already. Let's take a look at what happened when a web application developer decided, hey, let's see if we can actually create something that looks like MS Paint. And this is Canvas Paint. You just go to canvaspaint.org and give it a shot, try some different colors, and you find, oh my goodness, somebody has actually coded up an entire painting program in HTML5, CSS, and JavaScript using the Canvas element. And then sometimes you run into limitations. That's important to note. Not all browsers support all Canvas operations. So when you do code a Canvas graphics demonstration or graphics feature into your site, you still need to test across browsers. And that's an important point. It's an awesome, excellent feature to use to create some amazing effects. It still requires you to test cross-browser. Of course, what graphics discussion would be complete without an exploration of what games were possible. In this case, we've created this Laseroids. Someone's created this Laseroids demonstration that uses Canvas and JavaScript and events and their own voice, presumably, to actually make a game out of it. Somehow I seem to have lost all the asteroids. Well, if there's no asteroids, there's no problem, right? I guess that's how you win the game. All right. So as you can see, there's a lot of opportunities with Canvas, a lot of things you can do. The challenges. Big one with SVG. SVG is a separate file, works fairly well in browsers, across browsers even. One thing that HTML5 introduces is the ability to embed an SVG graphic, since it is just XML, natively into your HTML document. This is actually not well implemented. I've tested across numerous browsers. I haven't found very good support at all. Ironically, support for this feature of HTML5 is promised in IE9. However, without having some degree of cross-browser support, I wouldn't bother with trying to make this work until we see something different. Maybe in a year or so, things will change. With Canvas, a lot of opportunities, but there's still a lot of challenges. So I need to be really upfront with you. As I pointed out before, you need to test cross-browser to make sure that the different Canvas operations you use actually do work in the browsers that you want to support, which is hopefully all the browsers. First of all, it's implemented everywhere but IE. It's a big challenge. What does that mean? Well, for websites on the traditional web, the open web, you want to make sure your websites work across all browsers. There are some JavaScript libraries to try and emulate parts of Canvas in features that are built into IE, such as VML, and those are referenced in the various tutorials. However, it's still enough of a challenge that I recommend, well, Canvas requires good design for fallback. And that means that while I showed you a simple overlapping two squares example, I didn't even remember to update the fallback to 3 overlapping squares. It's a big challenge, and this is just a simple example for something like that Asteroids game or MS Paint. How do you present an alternative that makes any sense? I don't know. And especially if someone is not visually sighted, how would they access your Canvas content? And that's one of the really big challenges about Canvas. The accessibility techniques for how to use Canvas and do so accessibly while providing an alternate representation for information are still being developed. I'm not saying it's not possible. I'm just saying that it's not something that's very well understood right now. There aren't a lot of real-world examples. And if you look at most of the really cool whiz-bang Canvas demos, there's almost no fallback at all, if any. Never mind one that's actually accessible. So my recommendation for now is go ahead and use Canvas, but only for decorative images. Canvas is kind of at the point where rounded borders was maybe, say, about a year ago, and that is that you should only be really using it for decorative reasons in some browsers. In CSS, rounded corners have finally made it to the point where there is good cross-browser support, and it is promised in the next version of IE, so we're getting to the point where we can start to potentially depend on it. When that happens with Canvas, we'll be able to take those steps forward as well. So go ahead and build Canvas into decorative images, or experiments here and there, build your web applications, but I wouldn't rely on it for any sort of core functionality that you want to work across all browsers, because it's simply not quite there yet. Well, there's a lot you can do with Canvas in HTML5, but there's even more that you can do with audio and video, which I think is really worth exploring. So let's go ahead and take a look. HTML5 native audio and video comes down to some really simple elements. Really, this is all you need to know. Audio SRC and video SRC. It's just like the image element, but for sound, right? Or for video. So in this case, let me show you just a brief demonstration of what you can do with audio and the Canvas combined together. This is an experiment that uses audio to play some audio, as well as uses Canvas to draw these circles. Now you might be wondering, well, is that all it's doing? No, actually it's doing more. It's interactive. if I go ahead and click on one of these circles, it's pulling out tweets from Twitter that mention HTML5. So each one of these circles actually represents a tweet. If you can manage to hit another one. I can't wait to learn it and use it. The iPad is, of course, encouraging lots of HTML5 development. And apparently, it's even mentioned on the Howard Stern show. How about that? Video, like I said, similarly to the audio element, has a source SRC attribute that you just assign to your video file, and then you can go ahead and play videos right there in your HTML. And this really makes it a solid alternative to Flash and QuickTime video plugins. In fact, not just an alternative, but in some cases required, because mobile platforms such as the iPhone and the iPad don't support plugins in their browser, which means if you want to play video across as many browsers and devices, you have to start supporting HTML5 video today. And I'm going to show you how. Lots of sites are already doing this. Let's take a look at some that are. The following sites, Apple's published a list of that take advantage of some of the standards. What they're really talking about here in particular, though, is the HTML5 video support. If you go to CNN, Reuters, New York Times, Vimeo, Time, ESPN, Major League Baseball apparently, Netflix, NPR, even the White House is supporting HTML5 video. If all these major institutions are supporting it, so can you. Now, the capabilities of video, once you start integrating directly with HTML, lets you do some pretty amazing things. So before I go into the code examples, I want to show you one more example of what someone can do with HTML. This is a combination of HTML5 video and HTML5 canvas. On the left, there's a video. On the right, we're seeing use of the canvas element to capture frames of the video and then in real time in JavaScript do edge detection and draw that. So while you see the motion animating in the video, you can see that in the frame next to it, there's the canvas that's recognizing exactly where the objects are, where their edges are, and drawing those edges out. It's pretty amazing. All of this is being done completely in the browser. HTML5 video, canvas, and JavaScript. And you may be wondering, well, I want to get started with HTML5 video, but I don't really have any videos of my own to use, and a lot of videos out there, are proprietary, copyright, etc. So to get started learning how to use HTML5 video, I want to at least give you a pointer to some open source videos. Archive.org has plenty to choose from, and one that I recommend checking out because it does incorporate a bit of web development, web design, technology, community history, is the Barcamp San Francisco video. Even Archive.org, with their embedding of these videos, notices that your browser supports a new video tag. Would you like to try the new video? So Archive.org also supports HTML5. But here you can see that it's available in various different formats, such as MPEG-4. In this case, they're using a compression scheme like H.264, or even OGG video. It's not unreasonable sized downloads. So now, I'm going to go ahead and take you to a code example and show you how to program support for video. You start with just the video SRC tag. That's really it. Don't forget your close tag. In this case, I've already downloaded these videos for Barcamp SF, so I can go ahead and type in barcampsf.mp4, and I'm going to use the controls attribute to tell the browser that I want it to display video controls to control the movie. I can also create my own controls using HTML and CSS and JavaScript and script the video element. If your site has a specific look and feel, play button, you want to do your own scrubbing UI, all of that, you're free to do so. But for demonstration purposes and to get things up and running, I recommend just using the controls attribute. And as good citizens, we should always put some fallback content. In this case, we'll just say in a video showing Barcamp San Francisco. Great. Let's save this. Let's go to the browser. And you can see that we've got a video frame. And you can see that the video plays nicely. Let's go to another browser, like Firefox, and see what that does with our video element. Uh-oh, we get a big gray X. What's going on there? Well, it turns out that not every browser supports all the same video formats. In this case, Firefox doesn't support the H.264 video format that video was recorded in the MP4 container. However, I have it in another format, OGG Theory in particular. And so if I change this source to OGV, save, go back to Firefox, reload, you can see that the video now works. Now, I've showed you some of the opportunities with the video element and some of the amazing things people can do with it, but I also showed you a hint of some of the challenges, and I'm going to go into those in a little more detail. The key one here is audio and video format differences, and that is that different browsers support different formats. There isn't any one video format that's supported across all browsers that support the video element. And why is that? Well, let's take a look. WebKit and IE9 actually support H.264. This means that if you're coding for the iPad or for the iPhone or for the Android or for the Palm Pre, these all support WebKit. You can use, in fact, you have to use video that supports, that's in H.264. However, here's the catch. H.264 is a proprietary format, and it's held by a consortium that has said, okay, you're free to use this, as of now, as far as we know, through the year 2015. What happens as of the year 2015? We don't know. Will they extend the ability to freely use it, or will they start charging a tax for every time you want to play, post, publish, record an H.264 video? We really can't tell. H.264 is one of the better codecs out there. It has high quality, it has high compression characteristics, it's really good for networks. So that's one of the reasons why it's so popular. However, once you start using it, you can't be sure that it'll be free to use on your site forever. So that's a bit of a challenge to consider. And this is one of the reasons that both Firefox and Opera don't have support for H.264. On the other hand, they support a format called OGG. In this case, in particular, OGG Theora. And the reason that they support it is because it's an open source format with open source libraries that are available, and that they don't have to worry about anyone coming around and charging them for use of the format. However, it's open, but with intellectual property doubts. One of the questions that's been raised by the folks that develop or that are using H.264, various browser manufacturers are like, well, we'd like to consider supporting OGG. However, we can't be sure that as soon as we ship it, someone's going to come out and say, hey, you've got some technology in there that infringes on our IP rights and be sued for it. So there are a lot of doubts, there are a lot of big debates. We're going to have to take a bit of a wait and see approach. The market is obviously still sorting itself out. So what are we going to do in the meantime? Well, fortunately, HTML5 actually presents us with a technological solution to what might be a legal problem, or at least a technological workaround to just not knowing which format we're going to be able to use in the future. And that is the source element. You can use embedded source elements inside the video and audio elements to publish different versions of the same video in different formats. Beauty of this is that then you can encode your video in H.264, also encode it in OGG, publish both. Here's how you do that in the code. You just have two source elements. Again, you want to have some fallback content. And the browser will use the first one that it knows it can handle. So if we go to the example, and in this case, instead of having a source attribute here, let's go ahead and cut that and have a source element. And then another source element, but this time let's include the MP4 as well. Let's save that. Let's go to Firefox, reload. Looks like our video still plays. Let's try this in WebKit. And here again, we have a video that plays. So in both cases, we finally constructed a video element that works across at least the different browsers to support the video element. That's Safari and Firefox. It'll also work in Chrome and Opera. Now the only one that's left remaining here is IE. IE doesn't support audio and video elements up through version 8. In version 9, they have claimed that they're going to be supporting it, and in fact the IE9 preview does support the video element for H.264. So as you can see, it's really easy to code support for video in your HTML5. What's a little more challenging, though, is encoding for multiple formats and testing on multiple browsers. So in summary, this is what you need to know. Audio SRC, video SRC. And that works great. If you've got one video file, one format, that's all you've got to put in there. However, because of the fact that different browsers support different video formats, you probably want to encode your video at least twice in H.264 and Ogg-Theora, and then use the source element, source SRC, to reference both of those files and let the browser pick whichever one it claims it can support. In addition, what you want to do is to provide at least some amount of alternate text explaining what's in the video, what's it about, describe the content, etc. If the video is particularly lengthy, or the audio for that matter, provide perhaps a textual transcript of what's said or spoken and described in the video. This is because you want to make your content as accessible as possible and make your content available to as many people as you can. Let's talk about what you can do with forms in HTML5. In particular, all the new user interface elements, not just the input elements. You've got new form inputs, over a dozen of them that you can start using today in your HTML documents. You've got an output element and a details element, and I'll describe a little more about how those work. And finally, you've got the meter and progress elements. So what kind of new form inputs are there? Right? HTML has a lot of them already. Well, here are a few of them. There's new input for search, for telephone numbers, for URLs, for email addresses, for just a number, and in fact, for entering a color as well. And what you're seeing here is both the code to create these elements and what WebKit is presenting when you create these elements. So you can see that WebKit has support for input type equals search, where it's doing something different, right? Almost every website out there has a search box on it somewhere. And this helps you semantically indicate to the browser that, hey, this is a search box that I'm searching in for this website. What difference does that make? Well, by telling the browser this is a search input rather than just some random text input, the browser can then apply some heuristics. For example, if the user has searched for a bunch of things on your site before, they can then pre-fill a drop-down with suggested search items or recent searches, and that enhances the user experience. But wait, there's more inputs. The other half of the input elements are date time inputs, anywhere from just inputting a date to a date time to a month to a week, or just the time or the date time in the local time zone. So as you can see here, all of these look the same and are essentially just text boxes in WebKit. So you might be wondering, well, what's the advantage of using these? Well, we'll get to that. In summary, though, there's lots of new input types. There is some partial support in browsers today, as you can see from input type equals search, but more so, let's take a look at what the other browsers do. Here's a page that lists all those new input types, and one more that I haven't quite talked about. We'll get to input type equals range, and shows you that in WebKit, input type equals search is supported, and input type equals range is supported. Range is kind of cool because it allows the user to indicate a value in a range, and you get to set the min and the max, and what the current value is, optimum, all that through attributes, and it gives them a little slider. It's a little bit nicer than having to type a number or potentially click up or down through various different values. Let's take a look at what it looks like in Firefox. All these are just plain text input fields, which is nice. At least you get something, and the user can enter in a value, which means you're going to have to implement, if you use one of these in Firefox, some JavaScript to handle it, which you would have to do today anyway. Let's take a look at Chrome. Chrome, very similar to WebKit, because it happens to use WebKit as its rendering engine, also supports input type equals search and input type equals range. Now, how about Opera? Wow, there's a lot going on here. Looks like Opera doesn't really do anything special for search or tell, but URL. Let's take a look at that. It's got a little icon indicating, hey, this is a URL. Similarly for email, it has a little icon affordance for that as well. Input type equals number. Looks like it provides us a place where we can type a number or enter a number using up and down arrows. As you can see, there's still some challenges with these new input elements, numbers being cropped. I'm not quite sure what's going on there, but this is obviously getting towards the cutting edge of HTML5. Interesting developments. Color, no one's implemented that so far. And notice that the slider looks different in Opera than it did in Safari and WebKit or Chrome. Finally, the date and time inputs. Look at what Opera's done. This is amazing. You just hit one little drop down and it gives you a whole date and time. All I did was input type equals date, and this is what the browser is generating for me. I can go through different months. I can pick a day and it displays it. Same thing with the date time. And I can pick the time separately. It's cropped again. A little bit of a challenge there. I can pick a month. So if I pick a month of July, what happens? Displays cropped again. Here, a week. Displays the week in ISO week standard. And the time. And a date time in local time zones. So, what does this mean for us as web developers? Well, there is some partial support. And in browsers that don't support these new input types, you've got good fallback text box behavior. In other words, it just looks like a plain old input type equals text. If you need to add support to processing these specific types or to the various browsers that you want to support, you'll need to add JavaScript to do that. But you have to do that today anyway. What I recommend is that you start with simple uses. For example, H2VX is a site that takes a URL as input and then creates download URLs to give you all the H cards converted to V cards on the site, and even a link that you can copy and paste. So here we've got an input that's a URL. And for the most part, it just looks like a normal text box. But by using input type equals URL, you're indicating the semantic that the expectation is that the user will enter a URL. For the other input types, I suggest you try them in Opera to get an idea as to what the future might hold for what these input types look like. However, as you've seen, what you might be presented with to the user looks a little different, may not be what they expect, may not be necessarily the prettiest interface for these form elements. If you're okay with the default interface provided by the browser, then maybe that's fine. But if you want to provide a custom interface, you're still going to have to write script to provide that. And this is what really comes down to. As a web designer, you're really concerned about the overall experience that the user has visiting your site. And so, given that we don't know exactly how each of these browsers is going to implement each of these form inputs in the future, we don't know what the impact is going to be on the overall visual look and feel of our sites if we use these new inputs. So there's a little bit of a risk involved there. So it's a trade-off. On the one hand, you can enable more semantic forms, you can enable a potentially better user interface, better usability, perhaps even native access to platform accessibility by using these built-in new form inputs in HTML5. On the other hand, it's really difficult to predict what's going to happen to the layout. If you compare, for example, Firefox, which is giving you just plain text boxes for all these inputs that I didn't size at all, which is reasonable, to what Opera does, again, I didn't size these at all. It picked the sizes for each and every one of these. But unfortunately, in some cases, like input type equals number, and this is the latest Opera 10.10, it's getting cropped, right? Why would the browser pick an input size for me by default that would crop the display of the value? I have no idea. I think it's because we're starting to get into the more cutting edge of HTML5 features, and because a lot of folks maybe aren't depending on these as much, perhaps the browsers haven't provided as high a quality of implementation as they could. I think there's going to be a bit of a chicken and egg problem there, because for web designers to really take up and use these forms, the browsers are going to need to provide really nice, beautiful implementations that are, at a minimum, blend well with existing web designs and what the web designs designers are creating today, and ideally allow the use of CSS to style the look and feel of these form controls, to set their backgrounds and their colors, widths and heights, border colors, perhaps even control what happens to the inside of them when you click on them and get a drop down. In addition to the new form inputs, there are a few other elements that provide enhanced interactivity in HTML5. There's the output element and the details element, for example. In particular, the output element is used to represent the results of a calculation. This could be a number of things. Obviously, if you're building a calculator using web forms, the result that the calculator is displaying would be a good use of the output element. But it's not the only example. Let me show you another one. Hasten.cc is a URL shortener specifically for Amazon links. In particular, it takes any ISBN code or ASIN code, such as 10-digit numbers like these, and you enter one of those in, tell it to create a short link, and it creates a short link that looks like any other short link you might have seen, tinyURL or Jump or Bitly. However, it's different in a very important way. This short link is computed, not saved in a database. What that means is that anyone can actually take that ISBN number and, following the algorithm that's listed here on the very page itself, compute exactly how to convert it from that compressed computed form back to the extended ISBN and back. It's a completely reversible computation. So this is a good example of where this output could be marked up as an output element because it is purely computed. Details is used to mark up content that maybe shows you a little bit, like a heading or a summary about the content, and that the user twiddles open to see more about it. What does that mean? Well, let me show you a visual example, since explaining it may seem a bit abstract. On the W3C site, if you go to www.w3.org/tr, you'll see a list of all current web standards that the W3C has published in all stages, anywhere from working draft through recommendation. Because there's so many of these now, the W3C has grouped them by topic, and you can see that each one of these topics is by list. We can go to CSS, for example. If we click on CSS, it expands and shows us all the different CSS recommendations, notes, drafts, etc. that have been completed. This is what you would use a details element for. And how would you do that? Let's take a quick look at that. It's essentially two pieces. You've got the details element that surrounds all the content that you want to contain, and then you mark up the label, in this case, the word CSS, which expands to show all the rest of the contents, as a summary, this child of the details element. All the rest of the contents, well, there's no specific element to mark those up. So you could just use like a div if you wanted to use those, or if you want to style them. And in fact, the details element, just like figure, is one of those elements that's in a bit of flux. Showed you the list of grouped items. Next, the meter and progress elements. Remember, I said we'd get back to meter. Meter is used to indicate the percentage or a measurement within a range. Ratings, countdowns, or fundraising donations are great examples of when you would use a meter element. Let me show you some visuals. Here's an article on html5doctor.com that illustrates and demonstrates some of the examples for where you could use a meter element. For example, you could use it for a score, or for a rating, or for a review. And of course, if you're marking up a rating or review, I also recommend that you mark it up with the hreview microformat for enhanced semantics. You can use a meter for a countdown calendar. And in fact, you can also use the meter to indicate how far you are towards achieving a goal. In this case, donations, as we've seen in this example, are 74% towards achieving the goal. With the meter element, you can use simply just a percentage inline, open meter, like 74%, close meter tag, or you can use a fraction, open meter, 3/4, close meter, or if you want to indicate some other value, some other human readable value, you can indicate the actual value of the meter using the min, max, and value attributes to indicate the range from the min to the max and what the value is within that minimum maximum range. The flip side of the meter element is input type equals range. So when you want to display a percentage or measurement within a range, you use the meter element. When you want the user to enter a percent or a measurement within a range, you use input type equals range. And it takes the exact same set of attributes, min, max, and value, and displays for the user a slider or some other convenient user interface element that allows the user to pick a number within a range or pick a value within a range. Again, this works only in supported browsers. In browsers that don't support this input type, they're just going to display a text box. And so it's going to be up to you to detect that and provide some alternative user interface, perhaps with JavaScript. Progress is a special type of meter and was created specifically for task completion. What do we mean by that? Well, say you're uploading a video or a photo. That's an example of a task that you're waiting for to complete. Or doing an online checkout, which takes several steps. That's a task that you're waiting to complete. Or perhaps even filling out a multi-page form. These are all tasks that take steps forward and that the progress element indicates, okay, how many more steps are there, what's the maximum, and how far along are you? Let me show you a multi-page form example. This is a screenshot of a multi-page form. It's a survey, online survey, indicating that it's 24% complete. And if you've done any online surveys, those that provide you progress are much more encouraging than those that you have no idea how many more pages there are to go through. So if you do that, use a visual display like that, both graphical, hopefully, and numerical, and then use the progress element to mark it up semantically. So in summary, there's a lot of new user interface elements that you can make use of in HTML5. But in particular, the one that I think that is most usable today is input type equals search. It works really nicely and cleanly in browsers that do support it. In browsers that don't support it, you're just going to get a simple text input box, which looks close to what users expect today anyway for search. So it's one of those nice areas that you'll get progressive enhancement in browsers that support the feature of HTML5. Output, details, and summary. These are elements that currently aren't adding that much interactivity, so I would say use them cautiously. You're not sure exactly what the impact is going to be on your interface. For the most part, if you use output, it makes semantic sense. It's not going to alter the appearance there, or rather it shouldn't, as far as we know. I think it's worth using. Details and summary, like I mentioned, are a little bit in flux. The way that you embed the summary, that's changed over time. Similar to figure and fig caption, it's an element that's been in flux that we should really be more cautious with. Now, what I would recommend is perhaps using these elements in a little bit more experimental pages that you don't need to have out there and in production for a long amount of time. It's not clear that these elements are going to be what we end up using in HTML5. The meter and progress elements show a lot of promise for marking up otherwise non-semantic graphic elements in pages. So go ahead and use these and mark up your existing code. Like, don't change what you have, just add around it the meter or the progress elements to semantically provide more information to browsers that will be picking this information up. By now we've covered numerous new features and enhancements that you find in HTML5 that you can add to your site immediately to benefit your users, to benefit your search engine results, to benefit semantics, to benefit the overall web. What I'm going to talk about now is the remaining features that have been either spun out of HTML5 or associated with HTML5 that are, for the most part, not quite ready for production websites. And what do I mean by that? Well, most of these specifications have been spun out of HTML5 because they were a little bit advanced, and they're for intermediate or really advanced experiments. Now this means that they don't necessarily apply to all websites. They may only apply to some web applications here and there. However, I still feel that they're worth mentioning because those of you out there that have an interest in one of these areas may want to explore these further. The first of these is microdata. In the last 10 years, there's been a renaissance of the understanding of semantics and the semantic web overall. Starting in 2000s, when web designers as a whole shifted their use of class names from being presentational to being semantic, all the way through 2005 with the launch of microformats.org, which actually took a lot of that existing widespread practice of semantic class names and codified it into conventions that allow us to now exchange contact information, event information, reviews, and all other pieces of little micro content across the web between our desktop and our browsers and mobile devices. The whole notion of exchanging semantic information has reached the point where lots of folks want to create their vocabularies, want to exchange other information, and a lot of this has come to the point where we need a consistent way to do this in any markup. That's what microdata is. It's not really well supported. However, if you are into creating your own semantic markup, in particular, if you really like exploring vocabularies, creating your own vocabularies, take a look at microdata. If you tried things like RDFA in the past and found them cumbersome and perhaps not quite intuitive, you'll find that microdata solves perhaps like 99% of the same use cases, but with at least some of the simplicity of microformats. The next cutting-edge area of HTML5 is HTML device. HTML device specification for APIs that provide access through JavaScript to various aspects of the device, such as the video camera or input-output that you don't normally have access to a web page. However, if you wanted to build something, say like a video conferencing application or perhaps some sort of video streaming application, you'll want access to the camera or the video camera or the microphone or other such alternative input devices of your laptop or potentially a mobile device as well. The HTML device specification seeks to codify these APIs in a standard that web developers will be able to eventually use. The WebSockets API, we've seen this amazing use of AJAX over the past several years for more and more interactive websites. And we've seen clients communicating with servers asynchronously. We've seen IRC clients. We've seen games. What WebSockets does is take that to a lower, more fundamental level so that you can actually have higher bandwidth communication between web browsers, between servers and clients, and allow you to do all that from JavaScript directly. Now, not all applications really need that capability, but some of them can actually really use it. So if you're building such an application that has a lot of network traffic, that has a lot of communication that you want to keep lower latency, take a look at WebSockets API, explore it, see if it works for you. A few more bleeding edge specifications. Some of these weren't even spun off, but rather just related to HTML5 and may even have minimal or experimental browser support, which is why I want to call out a few of these in particular. The first is Web SQL Database. This one's actually pretty big. A lot of web applications and websites today are built around a client-server architecture where on the server there's a database of information, oftentimes in MySQL, that's served up bits and pieces at a time, constructed into an HTML page, and served to the user, to the browser, where the browser views it, manipulates it, perhaps submits a form, and the data goes back to the database, gets updated there. What are examples of these client-server browser database applications? Wikipedia. Wikipedia is built on MediaWiki, which itself has a server component that's built with PHP and MySQL. Every time you use Wikipedia and query it, you're asking the server to look in its MySQL database to come up with what is it that you're looking for, and then using PHP constructs a page and serves it to you. Well, the Web SQL database specification provides a standard SQLite API for the client. So what does this mean? What does it mean for the client to have a database? Well, what this enables is you can actually take code that was traditionally run on the server, convert it to, say, JavaScript, right, that uses SQL commands, and create a complete client-server database application that runs on the client completely. I think that the implications of this haven't fully been realized, but the possibilities here could mean anything from running your own complete copy of a wiki on your own local browser, never mind your own server, and then potentially communicating with a server and syncing changes back and forth. I think there's a lot of potential here, mostly for experiments though. If Web SQL Database is like the industrial storage solution for creating big storage client-based solutions, web storage is the simple extension of what we typically use cookies for today. So if you use cookies to store some client-side information, typically it's like login info, maybe a few site preferences, but not that much information. Web storage expands this. It takes the really simple to understand property value model that almost every programmer understands and knows by heart and extends it to the browser so that if you have a web page and the user's entered a whole bunch of data, you can actually be persisting that data in the browser so that if they close their browser window or if it accidentally quits or something else happens, when they reopen their browser window and re-access your page will have access to that web storage that you've been saving on the client side. This also helps for situations where you want to allow the user to continue using your website and making changes even while you're offline. And then when the browser goes back online, to sync those changes back with the server. I think that web storage has a lot of potential to turn a lot of today's applications that depend on a continuous internet link to working even when you're offline. And so I'm pretty excited about web storage. In addition to web storage, there's two more areas that I want to point out of HTML5's bleeding edge that I think are worth looking into. The first is web workers. How many times have you been on a website and you've run into the rainbow beach ball cursor of death, or perhaps the hourglass cursor of death? It's really annoying. Anytime I find that I'm browsing a website and it just starts spinning, my browser locks up, you know what's usually at fault? Well, not counting plugins, of course. JavaScript. Too much JavaScript that the website is running, that's taking up the processes, is taking up all the processors on your computer, slowing everything down, making it less interactive. Well, web workers is a solution to this problem as long as the web designer, web developer wants to take advantage of it. One of the challenges traditionally in developing a web application is that any script, anything that you wanted to run in response to a user action had to be run in the same thread as the user's interactivity. Web workers gives the developer the option to actually fork off another thread to run JavaScript and run processes, computations, things that are processor intensive, asynchronously with the user's own frontmost interactive process. And this has the excellent feature that the web developer can focus on the JavaScript that's in the user process on only user interactions, and anything else, loading data, processing data, all that kind of thing can be done in separate threads. That's what they're called workers. The final API that I'd like to point out to you that's on the bleeding edge of HTML5 is geolocation. Geolocation has become a really hot topic in recent years, especially with the emergence of sites like Foursquare and previous to that, Dodgeball. Geolocation has become the source of a lot of really interesting social networking, social websites. What Geolocation API does is present the ability for a web page to actually query the user's location. Now, of course, there's permissions models built into this. And web browsers that implement the Geolocation API have to ask the user, hey, do you want to allow this website to know your location? And at that point, the user is given the option of providing the information to the website or not. The website, though, is now given the ability to ask. So if the website says, well, I can now search for restaurants near where you are, if you'd like, rather than having to tell you to enter your location and then search for it. I could even actively track you, just for you, where you are, and then perhaps let you know if any of your friends are nearby, similar to what these Foursquare applications do today. Now, the implementation level of all of these varies from browser to browser, and it's one of those things that's constantly in flux. So if you're going to develop using some of these APIs of HTML5, using the bleeding edge of HTML5, as you would expect, what you need to do is make sure that you read the documentation specific to those browsers for those APIs and keep up with them. Just as any web developer knows that coding to the API of a specific website is at any moment subject to change, coding to some of these APIs is also subject to change because the browsers are implementing all these APIs which are in draft format specifications. By working draft, what that means is that the W3C can change those APIs at any moment, and implementations can't necessarily depend on them. What does that mean for you today? It means that you have to, if you're going to build applications that depend on these APIs, you need to either keep up with the development of HTML5, or you need to build your applications in such a way that if and when the APIs change, that they fail gracefully, that they don't actually put up unexpected errors. However, given all those caveats, I still say there's a lot of opportunity here to explore and expand the future of web applications and help move the web forward. So for more details on all of these bleeding edge APIs of HTML5, please see the accompanying booklet or text that describes where to find more information and provides URLs to these specifications as well as what you can potentially do with them. So we just finished talking about the bleeding edge of HTML5. A lot of features out there that are exciting and tantalizing and just out of reach for most users, most developers. Maybe you'll find some things to experiment with, maybe not. But let's move on. We're here now, we've learned all the other features that we can use with HTML5 at our final checkpoint, which is to revalidate. The key here is we've added a whole bunch of new features, new semantics, multimedia, audio, video, and graphics that you've never before used in HTML natively. So it's really important to revalidate and check your work. Make sure that if there are any things that you've done accidentally, have you closed all your audio tags, have you used enough source tags for your video, etc., that you make sure at this point that they are still working. So go ahead and use the Favelet that you downloaded before in the previous checkpoint to validate, to go ahead and validate your code changes now with all the new HTML5 features. When you go ahead and revalidate your content, you're going to find more often than not that the validator is going to return an error or two, or perhaps even just a warning. But regardless, anything that the validator complains about, you really should go in there and fix. So in this case, I've validated my content, and the validator is telling me, warning, attribute without value at line 87, column 93, read only. So what it's found there is it says read only is an attribute and it needs a value because we're validating here this document as both HTML and XHTML so that it works in both environments. In this case, any attribute that's self-standing, you should assign to it its own name. So in this case, read only equals quote, read only quote will be sufficient to fix the problem. So let's go ahead and do that and then revalidate. And upload your file. I'm going to go ahead and do that. And once you've made these fixes, revalidate. Great. Looks like we fixed all the problems and our document's now valid. So after you've done making necessary fixes, congratulations, you're using HTML5 now. In conclusion, I've told you a lot about keeping up with the bleeding edge of HTML5, and now we're going to teach you not only how to keep up with it, but how to participate and contribute to it. Because as a participant in the evolution of the web, it really helps to help shape it with your experiences. So what that means is, once you've been keeping up to date with the specifications, and you've been reading all these blogs, and you've been implementing HTML5 on your own site, you're going to develop a lot of experience with understanding what works, what doesn't, what could be better. And I'm here to tell you now that you can still make a difference in what HTML5 has in it and how it works, not only for your own sites, but for the future of the web. So you should jump in and participate in involving HTML5. There are a few key resources that you need to know about to really make an impact on HTML5. One of the big ones is that a lot of the work having been done at the What Working Group is actually on the What Working Group wiki. This is a wonderful resource that tracks literally different proposals for changing and modifying HTML5. It has an FAQ, frequently asked questions, etc. And it's community edited. It's wonderful. It's one of the really good examples of how a community can cooperatively build knowledge about a resource. Second, what you want to do is join and chat with the What Working Group IRC channel on irc.freenode.net. A lot of informal communication takes place on the IRC channel. In fact, there's experts on there almost any hour of the day that you can go on there, ask a question. Sometimes you might get a smart alecky response, but most of the time you'll get folks who are eager to help you, eager to understand. Sometimes your question will end up pointing out a problem. And in that case, you've reached exactly the people that you want to reach that may have a chance at actually changing the specification, drafting a change proposal, raising an issue, etc. The What Working Group is one area that you can contribute, but the W3C is another, and in fact, I'm here to tell you now that the HTML Working Group is very different than all previous working groups of the W3C in that it is open to anybody joining and participating. All you have to do is go to the HTML Working Group site, fill out a few forms agreeing that all your contributions are provided freely, essentially, and that you're not going to assert any patent rights on anything that you contribute to HTML, and then you can join the HTML Working Group mailing list, join the HTML Working Group as an invited expert, and contribute. Here are a few more resources to learn more about HTML5 and keep up with HTML5. HTML, the markup language. This is a summary specification published by W3C that lists all the new tags in HTML and all the change tags and gives you one-click access to quickly reference what they are. I've created an HTML5 Now community wiki that you can join and contribute to, and if you have any questions, you can go ahead and edit the wiki. I'll go ahead and keep updating it with more content and more references to links to other specifications and more things about HTML5. I want to also encourage you to take a look at the excellent book that's coming out, or probably it's come out by the time you've gotten this, called Introducing HTML5 by Bruce Lawson and Remy Sharp. Both of them keep blogs about HTML5 and have been contributing to HTML5 for quite some time. I strongly encourage you to read their book. I also recommend following the blogs of various folks that are involved both in the development of HTML5 and its evolution, both from the inside and from the sidelines and various different other perspectives. Some of these organizations and groups include the What Working Group, Ian Hickson, Jeremy Keith, Bruce Lawson, and Jeffrey Zeldman. All of them blog frequently about HTML5, and from their blogs, you can find plenty of other blogs about HTML5 that you can read and keep up with. Go ahead and take a look at the HTML5 Super Friends statement and feedback regarding HTML5. There's a lot of opportunity in HTML5, and there are a lot of challenges in evolving it. This is a good example of a group of colleagues getting together, a group of web designers and developers, evaluating HTML5, finding problems with it, recommending changes, and getting some of those changes incorporated into the specification. All of them are simply web designers and developers, probably just like yourself, that wanted to make a difference. And I'm here to tell you, as one of the HTML5 Super Friends, that you too can make a difference in HTML5. This brings us to HTML5 Now. And where does that bring you? It means you should get started today. You've learned everything you need to start your first HTML5 document. You've learned everything you need to update your pages, HTML4 or XHTML, to HTML5, both new semantics, semantic refinements, and enhance them with new features, new semantics, graphics features such as Canvas, and multimedia features such as audio and video. When you've added this support to your pages, to your sites, you've made them into HTML5, next thing to do is validate your pages, fix any problems, repeat until you've got a completely error-free HTML5 site, publish it, make it clear to the world that you're pioneering, helping pioneer HTML5 and move it forward. Finally, follow updates about HTML5 specifications and the discussions around them. Give feedback on your experiences with HTML5. If you run into problems with various different elements, provide feedback. If you run into problems with different implementations of HTML5 in different browsers, give feedback to the browsers as well as the working group. By doing so, you will perform an invaluable service and you will help move the web forward. I'm Tomtek Celik, and you can follow my updates at tomtek.com, and you can follow me on Twitter as @T. If you'd like to follow updates to HTML5 Now, you can do so on Twitter at the account @HTML5Now. If you'd like to learn more about any of these topics, please see the accompanying booklet.